Hey guys, tonight we begin a journey into the grandest dining halls of Renaissance England where kings didn't just eat, they performed. Where every roasted swan, every gilded peacock, every drop of wine told a story of power, politics, and the desperate human need to prove we matter. Picture this, the year is 1529. And Henry VIII has just decided his kitchen isn't big enough. Not because he needs more ovens, not because he's short on pots and pans, but because feeding his court has become the greatest show on earth, and he needs a stage worthy of a king. So he orders the construction of 55 separate rooms, 55 rooms, just for cooking. 200 staff members working day and night. Over 800 meals served twice daily. This wasn't a kitchen. This was a food factory, a culinary empire, a declaration to the world that said, I am so powerful I can turn dinner into destiny. Now, before we step into that magnificent, chaotic world together, I want to ask you something. If you're lying in bed right now, maybe it's late where you are. Maybe you've had a long day and you're ready to let your mind wander through history with me. Would you take just a moment to subscribe to this channel? Hit that like button if you're curious about the stories we're about to uncover, and drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from and what time it is in your world. I genuinely love knowing that we're sharing this quiet moment across continents and time zones. And hey, dim those lights if you haven't already. Let the soft glow of your screen be enough. Maybe turn on a fan or open a window so you can hear that gentle ambient sound. Get comfortable. We've got a feast ahead of us, and I promise you it's going to be unlike anything you've imagined. So let's talk about why Tudor feasts were never really about food at all. When Henry VIII expanded Hampton Court Palace's kitchens in the late 1520s, he wasn't thinking about hunger. The man had access to more food than any human could possibly need. What he was thinking about was something far more primal, far more human. He was thinking about control, about spectacle, about making absolutely certain that every duke, every foreign ambassador, every potential rival who walked into his court understood one thing without a shadow of doubt. This king could do anything. Think about it this way. In our modern world, we have social media, right? We post pictures of our meals on Instagram. We check in at fancy restaurants. We're constantly broadcasting to the world. Look at me. Look at what I'm experiencing. Look at how well I'm doing. The Tudors, they were doing the exact same thing just 500 years earlier. Except instead of a smartphone, they had roasted peacocks dressed in their own feathers with beaks gilded in gold. Instead of hashtags, they had entire rooms dedicated to creating architectural masterpieces out of coloured jelly. They understood what we're only now remembering, that what we eat, how we eat, and who sees us eat it, these things are never just about survival. They're about identity. They're about power. Now here's where it gets really interesting. Hampton Court Palace, Henry's favourite residence, became the beating heart of this culinary theatre. The palace sat beside the River Thames, close enough to London to feel the pulse of the nation, far enough to create its own world. And within that palace, the kitchen complex occupied nearly a quarter of the entire building's footprint. Let that sink in for a moment. 1/4 of a royal palace dedicated solely to the preparation of food. The numbers alone tell a staggering story. On any given day when the court was in residence, those kitchens fed between 600 and 800 people twice a day. That's not a family dinner. That's not even a restaurant. That's an industrial operation happening in the age before refrigeration, before gas stoves, before any of the conveniences we take for granted. Everything cooked over open flames, everything preserved with salt, smoke, or prayer. everything carried by hand through a labyrinth of courtyards and corridors designed with the precision of a military campaign. But here's the thing that really gets me. The detail that keeps me up at night thinking about what it must have been like. Henry created something called the bouche of court. Now that's a French term, and it literally means mouth of court. What it actually meant was that every single person of a certain rank at Hampton Court received free meals as part of their position. Breakfast at 10 in the morning, supper at 4 in the afternoon, plus daily rations of bread, wine, beer, candles and firewood. Imagine that. Your job title didn't just come with a salary. It came with thousands of calories a day prepared by 200 of the most skilled cooks in England. This wasn't generosity. This was strategy. Because if you controlled what people ate, you controlled them. If a nobleman knew that leaving court meant giving up access to fresh venison, to imported wine, to food that his own estate could never reliably provide, well, he thought twice before making the king angry, didn't he? The bouche of court was a golden cage, and the food was the bars. And the hierarchy, oh, the hierarchy was everything. Where you sat determined what you ate. What you ate determined who you were. The king, of course, dined alone, sometimes in his private chambers, tended by his personal French chef. Sometimes in the presence chamber, seated under an elaborate canopy called the canopy of state, eating in splendid isolation, while courtiers watched from a respectful distance. He was the only person in the entire palace given a fork. Yes, a fork, that simple utensil we use without thinking, because even the implements you used to eat signified your place in the cosmic order. Below the king, you had the great nobility, dukes and earls and bishops, dining in the great watching chamber or the great hall, their tables groaning under the weight of multiple courses, their cups never empty. Then you had the lesser courtiers, the knights and gentlemen, eating well but not extravagantly. And finally you had the servants, 230 of them entitled to rations but not to a seat in the great hall. They ate in their own meagre lodgings or in the kitchens themselves, camping out like soldiers on a battlefield, sleeping where they worked, their whole world smelling of smoke and roasted meat and spilled ale. But here's what fascinates me most about this entire system. It wasn't unique to Henry. This was the Tudor way, the royal way, stretching back through generations and forward through his children's reigns. When Elizabeth I sat on the throne decades later, her kitchens were still operating on the same principles, still grinding out hundreds of meals a day, still using food as the language of power. Let me paint you a picture of what this looked like in practice. In 1520, Henry VIII met with his greatest rival, King Francis I of France, at an event that came to be known as the Field of the Cloth of Gold. For 18 days, 18 entire days, the two kings tried to outdo each other in displays of magnificence. Tournaments, music, pageantry, and at the centre of it all, feasts that defied imagination. Thousands of tents, many made from actual cloth of gold, that shimmering fabric woven with real gold thread that cost more than most people would earn in a lifetime. Inside those tents, banquet tables stretched as far as the eye could see. The amount of food consumed during those 18 days is almost impossible to calculate. We're talking about whole herds of cattle, flocks of sheep, forests worth of deer, wine flowing in quantities that would make a modern music festival look restrained, and every single bite, every single sip was a message. I am richer than you. I am more powerful than you. I can afford to waste more in 18 days than you can produce in a year. Was it about diplomacy? Sure, on paper. The Treaty of London had been signed 2 years earlier, and this meeting was supposed to strengthen Anglo-French relations. But really, truly, it was about two alpha males showing off for each other and for the world. It was about using food as ammunition in a war of prestige. And that's the quiet truth about Tudor royal feasts that nobody really talks about. We focus on the exotic animals, the bizarre dishes, the sheer quantity of consumption. But we miss the point. The point was never the peacock. The point was what the peacock represented. It was a living, breathing, impossibly expensive proof that the person serving it to you could command resources beyond your wildest dreams. It was a reminder that nature itself bent to the will of the king. Think about what it took to serve a roasted swan at a feast. First, you had to own the swan. In Tudor England, all mute swans technically belonged to the crown. Eating one without permission was not just theft, it was a challenge to royal authority. So serving swan at your table meant you were either the king himself or someone the king favoured enough to grant that privilege. Already, before anyone takes a bite, the bird is doing political work. Then you had to kill it, pluck it, roast it, and if you really wanted to impress, you had to redress it in its own feathers so it looked alive again, maybe place a golden crown on its head. The labour involved was extraordinary. The skill required was rare. The message delivered was unmistakable. I have people who can do impossible things. I have wealth that allows for waste. I have power that transforms the natural world into art. Every feast was a carefully choreographed performance. The Tudors understood something that modern politicians spend millions on PR firms to learn. Symbols matter. Optics matter. The story you tell about yourself through the things you consume matters more than almost anything else. And the beautiful, terrible irony of it all. Most of the food at these feasts wasn't even eaten. Table manners of the time considered it rude to finish everything on your plate. You were supposed to leave food behind. Why? Because that leftover food would be distributed to the deserving poor waiting at the palace gates. It was charity, yes, but it was also one more demonstration of abundance. I have so much that even my leftovers could feed a village. So when we think about Tudor feasts, when we imagine Henry VIII sitting under his canopy, alone at his table, surrounded by the aroma of roasted meats and spiced wine and fresh bread, we need to remember he's not just eating dinner. He's governing. He's communicating. He's performing a role that he was born into and will die in. A role that requires him to be more than human, to be the living embodiment of England itself. And those 55 kitchen rooms, they weren't just practical, they were a statement. They said, I can transform a quarter of my palace into a machine whose only purpose is to feed my court, and I can do it so efficiently, so extravagantly, that visitors from across Europe will go home and tell stories about the English king's hospitality for years to come. Food in the Tudor court was never just food. It was currency, it was propaganda, it was art. It was the most visceral, immediate way to make people understand that they were in the presence of something greater than themselves. And tomorrow, well, not tomorrow, but in just a moment, we're going to step even closer to that royal table. We're going to shatter some myths about what Henry VIII actually ate on a daily basis. Because the story we've been told about the gluttonous king throwing chicken bones over his shoulder, that's Hollywood, my friends. The reality is far stranger, far more controlled, and in its own way, far more human than the legend. But that's a story for the next part of our journey. For now, let the image settle in your mind. 55 rooms, 200 people working in smoke and fire and chaos to create something that was never really about hunger at all. Rest well, we have so much more to discover together. You know what's funny? Almost everything we think we know about Henry VIII and food is completely wrong. Close your eyes for a second and picture him. Go ahead, really visualize it. What do you see? I'm willing to bet you're imagining a massive man in velvet robes, grease dripping down his chin, tearing into a turkey leg with his bare hands, maybe tossing bones over his shoulder while servants scramble to clean up after him. Am I right? That's the image we've been fed by movies, by television, by centuries of storytelling that turned a real human being into a cartoon character. But here's the truth, and I promise you, it's so much more interesting than the myth. Henry VIII was, by all contemporary accounts, an exceptionally neat eater. Fastidious even. He used napkins. He wiped his mouth carefully between bites. He ate slowly, deliberately, with what observers described as surprising daintiness for a man of his size. And here's the kicker, he was the only person in the entire court allowed to use a fork. Not for the meat, mind you. Forks weren't common utensils for eating in Tudor England. Most people used their hands, a personal knife they carried with them, and occasionally a spoon. But Henry had a special fork, and he used it exclusively for one thing: eating sweet preserves. Let that image replace the one in your head. The King of England, the man who would eventually weigh over 300 pounds, delicately spearing candied fruit with a fork while everyone around him ate with their fingers. The transformation of Henry's body is one of the most well-documented physical changes in royal history, and it tells us so much about what he actually consumed versus what we imagine. When Henry took the throne in 1509 at age 18, he was an athlete. Seriously, the guy was 6 feet 2 inches tall in an era when the average man stood around 5 feet 7. He had a 32-inch waist. He jousted. He hunted for hours. He danced until dawn at court celebrations. Foreign ambassadors wrote home describing him as the handsomest prince in Christendom, with golden hair and a physique like a Greek god. By the time he died in 1547 at age 55, that 32-inch waist had ballooned to 54 inches. His armour, which still exists today in the Tower of London, tells the story of this transformation in cold, hard steel. You can see the progression, suit by suit, year by year, as the metal had to accommodate an ever-expanding body. So what happened? Did he suddenly start eating like the movie version of himself, gorging on entire pigs while courtiers cheered him on? Not exactly. What happened was much more mundane and honestly much more relatable. He got injured. In 1536, during a jousting accident, Henry was thrown from his horse. He was unconscious for 2 hours. The horse, fully armed, had fallen on top of him. He survived, but his leg never healed properly. An ulcer developed that would plague him for the rest of his life, oozing and infected, causing constant pain. Suddenly, this man who had defined himself through physical activity couldn't exercise the way he used to. But his appetite had been calibrated for an athlete's life, and it didn't adjust. Here's where we get into the actual numbers, and they're staggering. According to the surviving documents called the Diet for the King's Majesty and the Queen's Grace, Henry's daily meal plan provided approximately 5,000 calories every single day. Now, for context, the average adult man today needs about 2,500 calories, so Henry was consuming double what we'd consider normal, and he was doing it in just 2 meals, because yes, the Tudors only ate twice a day. Breakfast wasn't really a thing for most people, including the king. You had dinner at 10 in the morning and supper at 4 in the afternoon. That was it. Everything you needed, all those calories, consumed in 2 sittings. But here's what's crucial to understand. Those 5,000 calories weren't coming from Henry sitting down and demolishing entire roasted boars. They came from variety. Astonishing, overwhelming variety. A typical dinner for the king might include, and I'm reading from actual court records here, cheat bread and manche, which were different types of bread made from varying grades of wheat flour. Beer and ale and wine, because water was considered unsafe even though Hampton Court actually had clean water piped in from springs 3 miles away. Thick broth called pottage made from whatever meat was in season. Chineness of beef, which is a cut from along the backbone. Venison cooked in a dark wine-based sauce called brewis. Maybe some lamb, perhaps a swan if it was a special occasion. Conger eel, which is a massive ocean eel that could grow over 6 feet long. And for dessert, although the Tudors didn't really have dessert as a separate course the way we do, perhaps some preserved fruits or a small sweet tart. Each of these items would be presented, and Henry would take a little from each. A bite here, a taste there. He had what we might call a buffet-style arrangement in his private chambers, with dishes laid out for him to pick from as he pleased. He didn't gorge, he sampled. But when you're sampling from 14 different dishes, twice a day every day, those calories add up fast. And here's something that blows my mind every time I think about it. The king's meals were prepared in a completely separate kitchen from the rest of the court. He had his own privy master cook, a man named John Bricket, who oversaw a private culinary operation dedicated solely to feeding Henry, and occasionally his queen. This wasn't about food safety, though I'm sure that was a concern. This was about control and exclusivity. The king's food was special, prepared by special people in a special place. Even in this most basic human need, eating, Henry had to be set apart. Most of the time, Henry ate alone in his private chambers. Think about that. The most powerful man in England, surrounded by 1,000 courtiers all vying for his attention, and he chose to eat his meals in solitude. When he did dine publicly, it was theatre. He would sit at a high table in the presence chamber, under that canopy of state we mentioned earlier, elevated above everyone else, eating while others watched. Not eating with him, watching him. The etiquette around these public meals was incredibly strict. A servant called a sewer, that's S-E-W-E-R, not the underground kind, would ceremoniously wash Henry's hands in scented water before the meal. The same servant would taste each dish before it reached the king, both to ensure quality and to check for poison. Every movement was prescribed, every gesture meaningful. Henry couldn't just grab a piece of bread. It had to be presented to him properly, by the right person, at the right moment. And the rules for everyone else? Equally rigid. You kept your napkin on your left shoulder, not on your lap like we do today. No elbows on the table, ever. No fists on the table either. You could wipe your nose on your sleeve, that was perfectly acceptable. But you absolutely could not scratch your head or pick your nose at the dining table. You ate what was placed in front of you with your right hand, using your left hand only to steady your plate or cup. If you needed to cut meat, you used your personal knife, the one you carried with you everywhere because the host didn't provide them. But here's what's really fascinating. Despite all this formality, despite the 5,000 calories and the private chefs and the elaborate presentations, Henry's daily diet wasn't that different from what other wealthy Europeans were eating. The ingredients were the same. The preparations were similar. What made Henry's dining experience extraordinary wasn't what he ate. It was the scale, the ceremony, the fact that an entire wing of his palace existed solely to ensure he never had to wait for a meal. Let me give you a specific example from the records. On a typical flesh day, that's what they called days when you were allowed to eat meat, Henry's first course might include fresh salmon, herring, cod, and plaice. Wait, I thought we said flesh day. We'll get to fish fasting days later, but even on meat days, they often included fish because fish wasn't considered flesh in the religious sense. Weird, right? Anyway, along with the fish, you'd have roasted venison, boiled beef, roasted pig, baked chickens, and maybe some game birds like partridge or woodcock. The second course would bring more meat, perhaps mutton, veal, roasted rabbits, along with elaborate pies. The Tudors loved pies. Meat pies, fish pies, pies within pies. Some pies were purely decorative, architectural marvels of pastry that weren't meant to be eaten at all, just admired. Others contained actual food, but were so heavily spiced and seasoned that modern palates would find them almost inedible. And between these courses, servants would bring what they called subtleties, elaborate sugar sculptures shaped like castles or ships or religious scenes. These weren't dessert in our sense. They were art pieces, status symbols, demonstrations of wealth because sugar was phenomenally expensive. We're talking more expensive than many spices. A sugar sculpture at your table meant you were so rich you could literally eat money. But back to Henry himself. As he aged and his mobility decreased, something interesting happened to his eating habits. He started having more and more of his meals in private, not because he was ashamed, Henry didn't really do shame, but because the physical act of getting to the presence chamber, of sitting through an entire ceremonial meal, became painful. That ulcerated leg constantly weeping, wrapped in bandages that had to be changed multiple times a day. The difficulty of moving his increasingly large body. The simple human exhaustion of always being on display. In his final years, Henry's personal servants would later write the king often ate in bed. Propped up on pillows, attended by only his most trusted grooms, he would pick at the food brought to him on golden plates. Not gorging, not throwing bones around, just a tired, sick, middle-aged man trying to find comfort in familiar tastes while his body betrayed him. And you want to know something that breaks my heart a little? Contemporary accounts say that even as he grew larger, even as his health failed, Henry never lost his fastidious table manners. He still used that fork for his preserves. He still wiped his mouth carefully. He still insisted on fresh napkins and scented water for his hands. Because even when everything else was falling apart, he was still the king. He still had to maintain the illusion of control, of dignity, of divine right. The myth of the gluttonous Henry VIII, the man tearing into meat with savage abandon, that myth serves a purpose. It makes him seem less than human, easier to judge, simpler to understand. He was fat because he was greedy. He was greedy because he was immoral. Simple story, satisfying story. But the truth? The truth is that Henry was a man who loved food the way many of us do, who found pleasure and comfort in eating, who associated certain dishes with happiness and celebration. And when injury took away his ability to burn those calories through the activities he loved, when chronic pain became his constant companion, when the reality of aging crashed into the expectations of kingship, he did what a lot of us might do. He kept eating the way he always had, even though his body no longer needed it. That's not cartoon villainy. That's heartbreakingly human. So the next time someone mentions Henry VIII and food, maybe you'll think of something different. Not the caricature with grease-stained fingers and a pile of bones, but a tall young man with a 32-inch waist who loved to dance. A middle-aged king eating alone in his chambers because public dining had become too painful. An old man in bed using a special fork to eat candied fruit, maintaining standards of etiquette even when there was no one important around to see. And now, speaking of what there was to see, we need to talk about the army of people who made all of this possible. Because behind every meal Henry ate, behind every morsel that passed his lips, there was an entire infrastructure of human labor that's almost impossible to comprehend. We've talked about the king at his table, but what about the 200 people working in those 55 kitchen rooms? What were their lives like? What did they see? What did they smell? What did they endure to keep the royal appetite satisfied? That's where we're headed next, into the heat and smoke and chaos of the greatest kitchen complex ever built in Tudor England. Imagine walking through a door and entering hell, not the metaphorical kind, I mean actual physical sweat dripping down your back, can't catch your breath, is that my skin burning kind of hell? That's what stepping into the great kitchen at Hampton Court Palace would have felt like on any given day in the 1530s. 6 massive fireplaces, each one big enough to roast an entire ox, all blazing simultaneously. The temperature hovering somewhere around 120 degrees Fahrenheit even in winter. smoke so thick you could barely see the person standing 5 feet away from you. And the noise, oh, the noise. 200 people shouting orders, clanging pots, dragging carcasses across stone floors, arguing about who forgot to turn the spit, all of it echoing off vaulted ceilings designed to amplify sound. This was where your dinner came from. This was the machine that fed the most powerful court in England. Let me take you on a tour of this place because the layout alone tells you everything you need to know about how seriously the Tudors took food. When Cardinal Wolsey first built Hampton Court Palace in the 1520s, the kitchens were already impressive. But when Henry VIII took the palace from Wolsey in 1529, and yes, took is the right word, Wolsey didn't exactly have a choice. One of the first things Henry did was quadruple the kitchen complex. He turned a quarter of his palace into a food production facility. Think about that ratio for a second. 25% of one of England's grandest palaces dedicated entirely to cooking. In modern terms, that would be like building a mansion and making the kitchen bigger than the bedrooms, living rooms, and bathrooms combined. It sounds insane until you remember what we talked about earlier. Food wasn't just food, it was all power. And power required infrastructure. The complex was organised like a military operation, which makes sense because that's essentially what it was. A campaign waged against hunger, twice a day, every day, with 600 to 800 mouths as the enemy to be defeated. You entered through something called the tradesman's entrance, basically a service gate where suppliers would deliver raw goods. Imagine carts pulling up at dawn loaded with whole deer carcasses, barrels of salted fish, sacks of flour, bundles of firewood, crates of live chickens, wheels of cheese, and baskets of whatever vegetables were in season. These goods would pass through a courtyard where clerks, actual bureaucrats with ledgers and quills, would inspect everything. They'd count, they'd weigh, they'd check for quality, because with this much food flowing through daily, the potential for theft and corruption was enormous. Every fish had to be accounted for, every loaf of bread logged. The paperwork involved in feeding a Tudor court would rival a modern corporation. From the inspection courtyard, porters would distribute goods throughout the complex. And this is where it gets really interesting, because different foods went to different specialised rooms. There wasn't just one kitchen, there were dozens, each with a specific function, each supervised by its own master craftsman. The flesh larder stored raw meat. The wet larder housed fish. The dry larder contained pulses, nuts and grains. 3 separate larders, 3 separate storage philosophies, because you couldn't keep fish next to dried beans or you would ruin both. Then you had the pastry room, where a dedicated team did nothing but make pie crusts all day long. The Tudors were obsessed with pies. Meat pies, fish pies, fruit pies, pies containing other smaller pies. The pastry room was probably one of the most important spaces in the entire complex. There was a spicery, a locked room where incredibly valuable spices from Asia and the Middle East were kept under guard. We're talking about substances worth more per pound than gold. Saffron, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg. A single nutmeg could cost more than a skilled worker's weekly wage. So the spicery had thick doors and trusted keepers, because spice theft was a genuine concern. The confectionery specialised in sugar work, those elaborate sculptures we mentioned, plus candied fruits, marzipan, and other sweet confections that marked you as wealthy beyond measure. The boiling house contained massive cauldrons where meat would be partially cooked before roasting, reducing the time needed on the spit and ensuring tenderness. There was even a room just for storing pewter dishes, because you needed thousands of plates and cups and bowls when you're serving 800 people twice daily. But the heart of the whole operation, the beating centre of this culinary empire, was the great kitchen itself. This room was dominated by those 6 enormous fireplaces I mentioned. Each fireplace had multiple spits, long metal rods that would pierce through meat and rotate slowly over the flames. And here's something that always gets me. Somebody had to turn those spits for hours in front of a roaring fire in a room that was already unbearably hot. Initially, they used children for this job, actual children, usually young boys, who would sit or stand beside the fire and turn a crank attached to the spit mechanism. Can you imagine? You're maybe 10 years old and your job is to spend 8 to 10 hours a day turning a handle while heat waves blast your face and the smell of roasting meat makes your empty stomach growl because you haven't eaten yet and won't until the nobles are fed. Eventually, some kitchens started using dogs. Special turnspit dogs bred specifically for this purpose who would run inside a wheel connected to the spit mechanism, like a hamster wheel but much larger and much crueler. The dogs would run, the wheel would turn, the spit would rotate, and dinner would cook. There are records of kitchen masters putting hot coals inside the wheel to keep the dogs running when they got tired. It's one of those historical details that makes you deeply uncomfortable with the past, while also recognizing that our ancestors were just trying to solve logistical problems with the tools and ethics they had. The organizational hierarchy in these kitchens was incredibly complex. At the top you had 3 master cooks. One served the king exclusively. That was John Bricket, who we mentioned earlier. One served the queen, and one oversaw food preparation for the rest of the court. These weren't just cooks. They were highly skilled professionals who had trained for years, who understood not just how to prepare food, but how to manage teams, how to plan menus, how to time courses so that everything arrived at the proper temperature at the proper moment. Below the master cooks, you had sergeants. Each department, roasting, boiling, pastry and so on, had a sergeant in charge. The sergeants commanded teams of yeomen, who were skilled workers, and grooms, who were less skilled but still competent. And at the bottom of the hierarchy, you had the scullions and kitchen maids, the people who did the truly back-breaking work. Scrubbing pots, hauling water, plucking chickens, gutting fish, sweeping floors. Their hands were permanently rough, stained, scarred from heat and knives and harsh lye soap. A Spanish ambassador who visited Hampton Court in 1554 left us an incredibly vivid description of the kitchens. He wrote about the organised chaos, the way different stations worked simultaneously without apparently interfering with each other. He compared it to watching a complex dance where everyone knew their steps perfectly. But he also mentioned the heat, the soak, and the smell, a combination of roasting meat, burning wood, human set, God knows what else that apparently clung to your clothes for days after a visit. And here's a detail that Henry himself had to address through an official ordinance. The kitchen workers had developed a habit of working shirtless or in ragged, minimal clothing because of the heat. Some were sleeping on the kitchen floors at night, right next to the fires, because they had nowhere else to go. Henry issued a decree demanding that the scullions stop going about naked or in garments of such vileness, and that they stop lying in the nights and days in the kitchen or on the ground by the fireside, which tells you 2 things. 1, conditions were rough enough that people preferred sleeping on stone floors near fire to whatever alternative housing was available. And 2, even the king couldn't completely control what happened in his own kitchens. Because here's the thing about this hidden army of 200 workers, most of them lived in the kitchen complex. It wasn't a job you went home from, it was your entire life. You worked in the kitchens, you slept in the kitchens or in tiny rooms tucked into the corners of the complex. You ate food from the kitchens, not the fancy stuff going to the nobles, but the simple rations allocated to servants. Bread and ale, beef and mutton, day after day after day. For most of these workers, this was actually a step up from other available options. A position in the royal kitchens meant regular meals, which was more than many people in Tudor England could count on. It meant a roof over your head, it meant proximity to power, and in that proximity the faint possibility of advancement. Maybe you start as a scullion at age 12, scrubbing pots with sand and ash. If you're smart and hard-working and lucky, maybe you become a groom by 20, learning actual cooking skills. By 30, if fortune smiles, perhaps you're a yeoman with real authority. And if you're exceptionally talented and well-connected, maybe, just maybe, you end up as a sergeant or even a master cook. But for most, the ceiling was much lower. You'd work in those sweltering conditions until your body gave out, until the heat and the smoke and the endless labour wore you down, and then you'd be replaced by the next desperate person looking for steady work. The rhythm of the kitchen's day was relentless. Work began before dawn. Fires had to be lit in all 6 fireplaces, which alone took significant time and massive amounts of fuel. Hampton Court burned through 1.3 million logs every year just for cooking. Let me say that again, 1.3 million logs annually. That's roughly 3,500 logs every single day. The logistics of acquiring, transporting, storing and burning that much firewood is its own entire operation requiring dozens of people. Once fires were lit, the morning preparation began. Meat that had been stored overnight needed to be brought out and inspected. Fish from the wet larder had to be cleaned and scaled. Pastry dough that had been resting needed to be rolled out and filled. The day's menu, determined by the master cooks based on what was available and what the season allowed, would be communicated down the chain of command. Each station would receive its assignments, and then the controlled chaos would begin. By 9 in the morning, the kitchens would be in full production mode. Spits turning, cauldrons bubbling, pastry ovens radiating heat. Servants running back and forth between the larders and the cooking stations, between the spicery and the preparation tables, between the kitchens and the serving areas. Remember, these rooms weren't all in one open space. They were connected by corridors and courtyards. So moving ingredients and finished dishes required constant foot traffic through a maze of pathways. The 10 o'clock dinner service was a military operation. Finished dishes would be brought to the serving place, a designated area where final presentations happened. This is where a peacock might get its feathers reattached, where a pie might receive its decorative crust topper, where sauces would be poured and garnishes added. From the serving place, an army of servants would carry the food through the cloisters, covered walkways surrounding courtyards, to either the great hall for most courtiers or the presence chamber for the king's formal meals. And then, before the plates were even cleared from the first meal, preparation for the 4 o'clock supper would begin. Because in between feeding hundreds of people twice a day, the kitchen staff also had to maintain the facility, tend the fires, receive new deliveries, process raw ingredients for the next day, and somehow find time to eat their own rations and maybe sleep a few hours. One of my favourite details from the historical records is about the beer consumption of the kitchen staff. Not the beer they were cooking with or serving to nobles, the beer they were drinking while they worked. Because in that heat, doing that kind of physical labour, dehydration was a serious concern. So kitchen workers were allocated substantial quantities of small beer, a lower alcohol version of regular beer, to drink throughout their shifts. A Spanish visitor apparently noted with some amazement that the English kitchens ran on copious amounts of beer, suggesting that the workers were slightly drunk most of the time. Whether that observation was accurate or exaggerated, it speaks to the absolutely punishing conditions these people worked under. And all of this, every fire lit, every spit turned, every pot scrubbed, every drop of sweat, was invisible to the people actually eating the food. When Henry sat down to his meal, he didn't think about the child who turned the spit for 6 hours to roast his venison. When a duke enjoyed a perfectly seasoned pie, he didn't consider the scullion who hauled the water to make the pastry dough, or the yeoman who painstakingly crimped the edges, or the boy who fed the oven with wood at precisely the right intervals to maintain proper baking temperature. The entire point of this massive infrastructure was to create the illusion of effortlessness. Food appeared as if by magic. Meals materialized at the appointed hour, perfectly prepared, beautifully presented, as though the universe simply willed them into being to satisfy royal hunger. The machinery was meant to be invisible. The labor was supposed to disappear, but it was there. Always there. 200 people working in conditions that would violate every modern workplace safety regulation, performing tasks that would break most of us within a week, also that 600 privileged individuals could eat without having to think about where their dinner came from or who paid the price for its creation. And speaking of price, there's another aspect of this Tudor feast culture that we haven't touched yet, one that's going to seem absolutely bizarre to modern minds. Because there were days, lots of days actually, when this entire meat roasting operation ground to a halt. Days when those massive fireplaces sat cold and those spits stopped turning. Not because anyone wanted a break, but because God said so. Or at least that's what the church claimed. We're about to dive into the strange world of Tudor fasting laws, religious loopholes, and the creative ways people convinced themselves that a beaver's tail wasn't actually meat. Here's a question that probably keeps you up at night. Is a beaver a fish? I know what you're thinking. Obviously not. Beavers are mammals. They have fur, they nurse their young, they build dams out of wood. They're about as fish-like as you or me. But if you were living in Tudor England and it was Friday, and you were really craving some meat but the church said you couldn't have any, well, suddenly that beaver tail on the platter in front of you became a fish, because the church said so. And if the church said a beaver's tail was fish, then who were you to argue with divine authority? Welcome to the wonderfully absurd world of Tudor fasting laws, where religious conviction met human appetite, and the result was some of the most creative rule-bending in history. Let's start with the basics, because the fasting system in Tudor England was actually far more complicated and all-encompassing than most people realise. It wasn't just Lent, that 40-day period before Easter. Oh no. The medieval church had created an elaborate calendar of meat-free days that covered roughly half the year. Every Friday, in commemoration of Christ's crucifixion. Every Saturday, in honour of the Virgin Mary. Most Wednesdays, representing the betrayal of Judas. The entire season of Lent, of course. Ember days. Special fast days occurring 4 times annually. Vigils before major feast days. Add it all up and you're looking at approximately 160 to 180 days per year when eating meat was forbidden. That's nearly half your life spent avoiding beef, pork, lamb, venison, and anything else that came from a warm-blooded land animal. For a culture that had built its entire social hierarchy around who got to eat what kind of meat, this posed a significant problem. Now you might think, well, couldn't they just eat vegetables? And technically, yes, they could. But remember what we talked about earlier. Vegetables were considered food of the poor. For a nobleman or a wealthy merchant to serve a vegetable-heavy meal was essentially to announce to the world that you'd fallen on hard times. Status anxiety is eternal, my friends. It's just that in Tudor England, it was measured in animal protein rather than Instagram followers. So the church said no meat on Fridays. The aristocracy said we can't possibly maintain our dignity eating peasant food. And somebody, somewhere, probably a very clever theologian with a fondness for seafood, came up with a solution. Fish doesn't count as meat, which seems reasonable at first, right? Fish live in water, they're cold-blooded. They're fundamentally different from land animals. Okay, fine, fish are allowed on fast days. Problem solved. Except that opened up a theological can of worms that the church would spend centuries trying to close. Because once you establish that fish aren't meat, you have to define what exactly counts as fish. And that's where things get beautifully, bizarrely complicated. The definition they settled on was essentially this. Anything that lives primarily in water and has a scaly or smooth aquatic body could be consumed on fast days. This made sense for obvious things like cod, herring, salmon, and plaice. These were your standard fast-day proteins, available in abundance from the North Sea and rivers throughout England. The royal kitchens at Hampton Court would process enormous quantities of fish on Fridays and Saturdays. We're talking hundreds of pounds of various species, all needing to be cleaned, prepared and cooked in ways that befitted royal tables. But then people started testing the boundaries of the definition. Eels, for instance. Eels are fish, clearly. They live in water, they have that smooth fish-like body. So eels were absolutely permitted on fast days, and they became incredibly popular. Conger eels, those massive ocean-dwelling creatures that could grow longer than a man is tall, were considered a delicacy. Eel pies, often sweetened with dried fruits and honey, in that strange Tudor way of combining savoury and sweet, appeared regularly on fast-day menus. Then somebody looked at a lamprey. Now, if you've never seen a lamprey, imagine a nightmare snake with the circular mouth full of teeth, basically an aquatic horror show. But it lives in water, so by the established definition, it must be fish. King Henry I famously died in 1135, supposedly from eating too many lampreys, but that didn't stop the Tudors from loving them. Lamprey pies became prestigious gifts exchanged between nobles, sometimes cooked in the creature's own blood to create a dark, rich sauce that sounds absolutely revolting to modern sensibilities, but was apparently delicious if you lived in the 16th century. Are you starting to see where this is going? The definition of fish kept expanding to include anything that was vaguely aquatic. Porpoises and dolphins, which we now know are marine mammals, were classified as fish because they lived in the ocean. They appeared regularly on Tudor tables during Lent and other fast periods. Historical records show that Catherine of Aragon, Henry's first wife, was particularly fond of both seal and porpoise. Seal, let that sink in for a moment. A woman who would eventually be remembered as the most pious of Henry's wives was eating seal meat and calling it fish, so she could technically follow church fasting laws. Whales fell into the same category. Whale meat was actually quite common and relatively inexpensive because North Sea whaling provided a steady supply. One whale could feed hundreds of people, making it economically attractive. It was typically boiled for hours until tender, or sometimes roasted, though accounts suggest it was tough and fishy tasting even when well prepared. But it was allowed on Fridays, so into the diet it went. And then we arrive at the beaver tail, which might be the most egregious example of theological gymnastics in the entire fasting law system. Beavers are unquestionably land mammals. They build homes on land, they eat vegetation, they're covered in fur. There's absolutely nothing fish-like about them except for one thing. They have these large, flat, scaly tails that they use for swimming and balance. Those tails spent a lot of time in water. Some enterprising clergyman somewhere in medieval Europe made a ruling that beaver tails could be classified as fish because the tail was the aquatic part of an otherwise terrestrial animal. And somehow this reasoning stuck. Beaver tail became an accepted fast-day food throughout Christendom. The tails would be grilled or roasted and served on Fridays, allowing nobles to technically abstain from meat while still eating something that came from a mammal. The logic is so tortured it's almost beautiful. It's like saying you can eat chicken on a fast day as long as you only consume the feet because the chicken walks on the ground and feet have scales. But that was the world they lived in. A world where rules mattered intensely, but interpreting those rules was an art form unto itself. Now you might be wondering, did people actually believe these classifications made theological sense? Or were they just going through the motions to avoid being accused of heresy? And the answer is probably both, depending on who you asked. The church hierarchy maintained the rules with absolute seriousness. Breaking fast day restrictions wasn't a minor transgression. It could get you accused of heresy, which in turn could get you imprisoned, or worse. There are records of people being punished for eating meat on forbidden days, their violations reported by neighbours or servants. But at the same time, the very existence of these loopholes suggests a certain winking awareness that everyone was playing a game. We say, beaver tail is fish. You say, beaver tail is fish. God presumably knows better, but we're all pretending together. And that shared pretense is what holds society together. Henry VIII himself was actually quite serious about fasting laws for most of his life, which is fascinating given his reputation for excess. Despite his ever-expanding stomach and his love of food, he genuinely observed Friday and Saturday abstinence from meat. His kitchens maintained separate menus for flesh days and fish days. The scale of fish consumption on fast days at Hampton Court was enormous, probably equal to or exceeding the meat consumption on flesh days, just with different proteins. But here's where it gets politically interesting. In 1549, after Henry's death, his young son, Edward VI, issued a decree that reinforced and actually expanded the fasting requirements. Fridays and Saturdays were confirmed as non-meat days, as we'd expect. But Edward added a new restriction: no meat on Wednesdays either. This wasn't just about piety, it was about economics and politics. See, the English fishing industry was crucial to the national economy. It employed thousands of people. It trained sailors who could be called up for naval service during wartime. It provided protein that didn't require valuable grazing land. By legally requiring people to eat fish multiple days per week, the government was essentially subsidizing an entire industry while maintaining the fiction that this was about religious observance. And the penalties for breaking these laws were no joke. Under Edward's decree, you could face 3 months in prison for slaughtering animals for food on a prohibited day. 3 months. 3 for eating a steak on the Friday. The seriousness of enforcement varied depending on local authorities and political climate, but the fact that such harsh penalties existed tells you how intertwined religion, economic, and state power had become. Then Elizabeth I took the throne in 1558, and she continued her half-brother's policies but added her own twist. In 1563, she introduced a prohibition on animal slaughter for Wednesdays as well, making it a statutory fast day across the realm. But, and here's the delicious hypocrisy, she also created a system where you could purchase a license that allowed you to eat meat on any day of the week you pleased. Think about that for a second. The Queen declares that eating meat on certain days is against God's will, punishable by imprisonment. But if you pay the government enough money, suddenly God doesn't mind. The cost of these licenses varied based on your social status, which meant that the wealthy could essentially buy their way out of religious restrictions while the poor had to genuinely abstain. It's the medieval equivalent of modern carbon offset credits. Pay enough money and your sin becomes somehow acceptable. The theological justification for this was that the licenses were only granted for legitimate health reasons. If you were ill, and your physician certified that you needed meat for your constitution, well then of course God would understand, but in practice, health reasons became code for wealthy enough to afford the license fee. Records show that plenty of healthy noblemen obtained these permits, while genuinely sick poor people had no such option. What's striking to me is how this entire system reveals the eternal human talent for finding loopholes in any set of rules we create. The Church wanted to impose discipline, to remind people through bodily denial that they were spiritual beings with obligations beyond physical comfort. Noble intention, genuinely. But when you run that intention through the machinery of real human behavior, what you get is a complex web of exception, categories, and creative interpretations that allow people to feel like they're following the rules while doing more or less whatever they wanted in the first place. And the food itself, the dishes created specifically for fast days, became their own category of culinary achievement. Since you couldn't rely on the rich fatty satisfaction of roasted meat, Tudor cooks had to get creative with fish preparation. They developed elaborate sauces. They experimented with spice combinations that would make fish more interesting. They created fish pies with pastry so rich and complex that you almost forgot you weren't eating meat. Almond milk became hugely important during Lent, when even dairy was forbidden. Since you couldn't use cow's milk or butter, cooks ground almonds into a paste, mixed it with water, and used the resulting liquid as a substitute in everything from sauces to desserts. It's actually quite similar to the almond milk we drink today, which means we've come full circle. The Tudors were making almond milk out of religious necessity, and we make it because we think it's healthier or more sustainable. Different reasons, same result. The Friday fish markets in London were apparently spectacular affairs. Every tavern, every cook shop, every street vendor suddenly switched to selling fish dishes. The variety was staggering. Grilled, fried, baked, stewed, pickled, smoked. Oysters were incredibly cheap and abundant, eaten by everyone from kings to beggars. Herrings were salted and packed in barrels, providing protein that could last through winter. Stockfish, dried cod beaten until it broke into edible pieces, was a staple for those who couldn't afford fresh fish. But even as people adapted, even as the culture created a whole ecosystem around fasting laws, there was this underlying current of resentment. Because fundamentally, being told what you can and cannot eat feels like a very personal intrusion. It doesn't matter if the reasoning is theological, environmental, or economic. When someone else controls your diet, they control a fundamental aspect of your daily life, and humans generally don't like that. This tension would eventually contribute to the English Reformation's popular appeal. When Henry VIII broke with Rome, one of the subtle but significant changes was that fasting laws became state policy rather than church doctrine. The rules didn't immediately change much, but the psychological shift mattered. Your Protestant English king was telling you when to fast, not some foreign pope in Rome. It was the same restriction, but it felt different because the source of authority had changed. And yet through all of this, through the theological debates and economic policies and royal decrees, the simple human desire for a good meal persisted. People wanted what they couldn't have. They found ways around restrictions. They convinced themselves that aquatic mammal tails were somehow different from terrestrial mammal legs. They paid bribes and obtained licenses and whispered to each other about which butcher might sell you meat on a Friday if you knocked on the back door after dark, because that's what we do. We create elaborate systems of rules to govern behavior, and then we spend enormous creative energy finding ways to honor those rules in letter, while violating them in spirit. The Tudors didn't invent this practice, but they certainly perfected it. But all of this talk about what counted as fish and which days required which proteins, it's been about categories and definitions. What we haven't discussed yet is the spectacle. Because when the Tudors did serve fish on fast days, or when they served meat on flesh days, they didn't just plop it on a plate and call it done. Oh no, they turned it into performance art. They created dishes so visually stunning, so elaborately presented, so impossible to look away from, that the food itself became secondary to the show. And that's where we're headed next. Into the realm of peacocks breathing fire and swans crowned in gold, where dinner became theatre and the stage was your plate. Picture yourself as a guest at a Tudor banquet. You've travelled for days to reach Hampton Court, your finest clothes packed carefully in leather trunks. You've bathed, a rare luxury, and dressed in your best velvet doublet, your most expensive jewellery. You're seated in the great hall, candlelight flickering off tapestries that cost more than your house. The room smells of wood smoke and perfume and anticipation. Musicians play softly in the gallery above. And then the doors at the far end of the hall swing open. What enters isn't just food. It's a procession, a ceremony, a statement. 6 servants in livery carry an enormous silver platter, moving in perfect synchronized steps. On that platter sits what appears to be a living peacock, its magnificent tail feathers fanned in full display, iridescent blues and greens catching the candlelight. Its head is raised proudly, its beak gleams with what looks like molten gold, and then, impossibly, smoke begins to drift from that golden beak. Not just smoke, flames. Small dancing flames that make it look like this beautiful bird is breathing fire. The hall goes silent. Every eye is fixed on this impossible sight. And in that moment, before anyone takes a single bite, the host has won. Because that's not food walking toward you. That's power made visible. That's wealth transformed into wonder. This is what Tudor food presentation was really about. We've talked about what the Tudors ate, about the quantities and the costs and the labour involved, but we haven't yet addressed the sheer theatrical genius of how they presented it. Because in the world of Tudor feasting, how something looked was often more important than how it tasted. The visual spectacle, the gasp-inducing moment when a dish was revealed, the stories guests would tell for years afterward, that was the real goal. Let me walk you through the process of creating that fire-breathing peacock, because understanding the work involved makes the whole thing even more impressive. First, you needed to acquire a peacock, which wasn't simple. These birds weren't native to England, they'd been imported from Asia centuries earlier and were kept by the wealthy as ornamental animals. Owning peacocks was itself a status symbol. They required special care, special housing, special food. So killing one for a feast meant you were wealthy enough to destroy something beautiful and expensive just to impress your guests. The bird would be killed, and then came the truly painstaking part, skinning it without damaging the feathers. This required extraordinary skill. You had to carefully separate the skin with all its attached plumage from the body, keeping everything intact. One wrong cut and the whole visual effect would be ruined. The feather cape, as it was sometimes called, would be set aside while the meat was prepared. Now here's the thing, peacock meat is terrible. It's tough, it's gamey, it's dry no matter how you cook it. Medieval and Tudor cookbooks are remarkably honest about this. They don't pretend peacock is delicious. They just accept that you're not serving peacock for the flavour. You're serving it for the statement. So the meat would be roasted, usually basted heavily with lard or butter, to try to keep it from becoming completely inedible, and seasoned aggressively with expensive spices to mask the natural taste. While the peacock was roasting, skilled servants would prepare the beak. Gold leaf, actual gold, hammered into sheets so thin you could see light through them, would be applied using egg white as adhesive. This wasn't cheap. Gold leaf cost a fortune, but that was the point. You were literally covering part of your dinner in gold to prove you could afford to do so. Once the meat was cooked, it had to cool enough to handle. Then the really technical work began, reassembling the bird so it looked alive again. The roasted body would be carefully positioned on the platter, sometimes with wooden supports inside to maintain the shape. The skin with its feathers would be draped back over the body and secured. The tail feathers would be fanned and arranged using hidden wires or supports. The gilded head would be positioned at exactly the right angle to suggest alertness, pride, life. And then came the fire trick. Ambitious cooks would soak cotton or small pieces of cloth in alcohol or camphor, a waxy, flammable substance. This would be placed carefully inside the beak. Just before the peacock was presented to the hall, someone would light the camphor. The flames would burn slowly. creating that supernatural effect of a bird breathing fire and smoke. Can you imagine the planning involved? The timing had to be perfect. Light it too early and the flames burn out before you reach the hall. Too late and you risk setting the whole thing ablaze in front of everyone. The servants carrying the platter had to move smoothly despite the fact that they were transporting a flaming bird. One stumble, one sudden movement, and you'd have a disaster instead of a triumph. And here's what kills me. After all that work, after all that expense and skill and theatrical presentation, most guests wouldn't actually eat the peacock. They'd applaud, they'd marvel, they'd tell everyone they knew about the incredible fire-breathing bird they saw at Lord So-and-so's feast. But eating it, that dry, tough, overspiced meat that had been dead for hours, dressed in its own skin like some kind of culinary taxidermy. Most people took one polite bite and moved on to something that actually tasted good. The whole exercise was about the moment, about creating a memory, about ensuring that when those guests went home and told their families and friends about the feast, they'd have something extraordinary to report. Swans received similar treatment, though without the fire-breathing element. After being roasted, they'd be redressed in their white feathers and presented to the table wearing a small golden crown. The symbolism was obvious. Swans were royal birds, property of the crown, so serving one was a reminder of your connection to royal power. The crown just emphasized the point in case anyone missed it. But the really elaborate presentations went beyond just refeathering birds. Tudor cooks created entire scenes, miniature worlds constructed from food and decorative elements. Subtleties, which we mentioned briefly before, were sugar sculptures that could reach enormous sizes. I'm not talking about a little decorative sugar work like you might see on a modern cake. I'm talking about architectural models built entirely from sugar, marzipan and paste. Castles with working drawbridges, ships with full rigging and tiny sugar sailors, biblical scenes with dozens of figures, each one painstakingly moulded and painted. These pieces would be placed on the table between courses, sometimes lit from behind with candles to make them glow. They weren't meant to be eaten immediately. They were meant to be admired, discussed, analysed for their political or religious symbolism. Sometimes they contained hidden meanings, messages from the host about current events or political alliances. Guests would study them like we might study a painting in a museum, looking for layers of meaning. The cost of these sugar sculptures was absolutely staggering. Remember, sugar in Tudor England was worth more per pound than many spices. It was imported from distant colonies at great expense and effort, using hundreds of pounds of it to create a sculpture that would be destroyed and eaten within a few days was an almost violent display of wealth. It said, "I am so rich that I can literally eat my money and it doesn't matter." Then there were the architectural jellies, which might be even more impressive from a technical standpoint. Making jelly in the Tudor period wasn't like opening a box of Jell-O. It was a multi-day process that required serious skill and patience. You'd start with calves' feet or shavings of antler horn, sometimes with isinglass, which is a gelatin derived from fish bladders. These would be boiled for hours, hours, sometimes up to 8 or 10, until they broke down and released their natural gelatin. The resulting liquid would be strained multiple times through increasingly fine cloth to remove any particles or impurities. Then you'd flavour it with spices, sugar and wine. You'd colour it using natural dyes, saffron for yellow, sandalwood for red, turnsole for purple. The really ambitious cooks would create layered jellies in elaborate moulds, each layer a different colour, each one requiring hours to set before the next could be added. They'd make jelly castles, complete with towers and battlements, jelly coats of arms displaying the host's heraldry. Some even created jelly maps, representing territories or estates owned by the host. These weren't just impressive visually, they were engineering challenges. Getting jelly to set properly in a time before refrigeration creating structures that would hold their shape in a warm banquet hall, achieving transparent clarity so the colours showed brilliantly. All of this required knowledge that had been built up over generations of trial and error. And here's a detail I absolutely love. Sometimes these jelly structures would have real gold and silver leaf suspended inside them. Imagine cutting into a clear red jelly castle and seeing flecks of actual gold floating in the translucent walls. It was magic. It was excess. It was everything Tudor food culture aspired to be. The serving vessels themselves became part of the presentation. Wealthy households commissioned special serving platters just for specific dishes. There were platters shaped like fish for serving fish dishes, platters with decorative edges depicting hunting scenes for serving game. Some of these pieces were works of art in their own right, silver or gold elaborately engraved, worth more than most people would earn in their lifetime. And portion sizes at these feasts were carefully calibrated for visual impact rather than actual consumption. A whole roasted boar might be brought out on a massive wooden platter, carried by 4 strong men, its tusks gilded, and an apple placed in its mouth in the classic presentation style. It would make one circuit of the hall so everyone could see it, marvel at its size, appreciate the host's generosity. Then it would be taken away to be carved in a back room, and portions would be distributed. The spectacle came first. The actual eating was almost an afterthought. There's a wonderful account from a visiting Italian diplomat in 1527 describing a feast at Hampton Court. He talks about being overwhelmed not by the quantity of food, but by the artistry of presentation. He mentions peacocks that appeared alive, pies so large they required 2 men to carry them, and a subtlety depicting the Garden of Eden complete with tiny marzipan animals and a sugar serpent coiled around a tree. He writes that he spent more time looking at the food than eating it, which he admits made him feel slightly foolish. But he couldn't help himself. It was too beautiful to ignore. That, right there, is the perfect encapsulation of what Tudor feasts were trying to achieve. Food that was too impressive to eat. Dishes that made you forget you were hungry because you were too busy being amazed. There was even competitive one-upmanship among the nobility about who could create the most elaborate presentations. If Lord A served a peacock dressed in its feathers, then Lord B needed to serve 2 peacocks arranged to look like they were fighting. If Duke C had a sugar castle, then Earl D commissioned a sugar castle with working doors and windows filled with translucent coloured sugar to look like stained glass. It was an arms race of aesthetic excess, each noble family trying to outdo the others in pure visual spectacle, and the really clever hosts would time their presentations for maximum impact. You wouldn't bring out your most impressive dish first. No, you'd build anticipation. The first few courses would be lovely but relatively conventional. Then, just as guests were starting to relax, starting to think they'd seen what this feast had to offer, the doors would open and something completely unexpected would enter. A pie that, when cut open, released live birds that flew up into the rafters. A roasted swan presented in a nest made of spun sugar. A subtlety so elaborate that people stood up from their seats to get a better look. The psychology of it is fascinating because it's not that different from what we do today with social media. We're constantly curating our lives for maximum visual impact, choosing what to share based on how impressive it will look to others. The Tudors were doing the exact same thing, just with roasted birds instead of Instagram posts. The platform changed. The impulse didn't. But here's something we don't often consider. What happened to all this elaborate presentation after the feast? Those sugar sculptures couldn't be saved. They'd be broken apart and eaten by servants or distributed to the poor. Those careful jelly constructions would melt or collapse within days. The gilded peacock feathers would be discarded. All that work, all that expense, all that artistry was designed to be temporary, ephemeral. It existed for a few hours of wonder, and then it was gone. There's something almost melancholy about that, isn't there? So much human effort poured into creating beauty that was meant to be destroyed. But maybe that was part of the point. Maybe the very fact that these creations were temporary made them more valuable, more precious. You had to be there to see them. You couldn't take a picture. You couldn't preserve the experience. All you could do was witness it, remember it, and tell others about it. In a way, that made the memories more powerful. When that Italian diplomat went home and told people about the Garden of Eden subtlety, he was the only source. His words were the only record. The experience couldn't be replicated or verified. It existed in the realm of story, which meant it could grow in the telling, become legendary. And that brings us to something we haven't really addressed yet, the sheer quantity of food involved in these feasts. Because we've been talking about presentation, about spectacle, about individual dishes, but we haven't gotten into the numbers, the actual staggering, almost incomprehensible volume of animal protein that moved through Tudor royal kitchens. And when you see those numbers, when you really understand the scale of consumption, it changes how you think about everything we've discussed so far. That's the territory we're entering now, the arithmetic of appetite, the mathematics of excess, the cold hard data that reveals just how extreme Tudor feasting culture actually was. Let me give you a number, and I want you to really sit with it for a moment. 14,390. That's how many large animals were slaughtered in a single year to feed the royal court at Hampton Court Palace during Henry VIII's reign. Not across all of England, not spread among all the nobility, just one palace, one kitchen complex, 1 year, 14,000 animals, each one born, raised, transported, killed, butchered and cooked to satisfy the appetites of roughly 600 people living at court. Break that down per person and you're looking at about 23 large animals consumed annually by each member of the household. That's nearly one animal every 2 weeks for every single person in residence. And when I say large animals, I mean creatures that weighed hundreds of pounds. We're not talking chickens here. We're talking oxen and sheep and deer and pigs. Living, breathing mammals that required acres of land to graze, months or years to reach slaughter weight, and significant human labour to manage. Let me break down those numbers more specifically, because the details make it even more staggering. According to surviving household account books from Elizabeth I's reign, Henry's daughter who inherited his palaces and his appetite for grandeur, the annual meat procurement for the royal court included 1,240 oxen. Picture that for a second. 1,240 oxen, each one probably weighing over 1,000 pounds. That's more than 1,000,000 pounds of beef every year from a single source of protein, 8,200 sheep. Can you visualize 8,000 sheep? That's a flock so large it would take hours to count. Imagine them all in one field, this massive undulating sea of wool and bleating, and every single one destined for the royal table, 2,330 deer. Now, deer weren't farmed like sheep or cattle. They had to be hunted or managed in deer parks, enclosed forests where nobles held exclusive hunting rights. Harvesting over 2,000 deer annually required maintaining vast estates specifically for that purpose. This was land that couldn't be used for agriculture or housing. It existed solely so the king and his court could eat venison. 760 calves. These were young cattle, slaughtered for their tender meat. Veal was considered a delicacy, prized for its soft texture and mild flavour. But think about what this number represents from an agricultural standpoint. Those calves weren't just meat. They were potential breeding stock, future oxen, agricultural capital killed before they could reproduce. Only the incredibly wealthy could afford to consume their own future this way. 1,870 pigs. Pigs were efficient meat producers, able to eat almost anything and convert it into protein. But they still required feed, space and management. Nearly 2,000 pigs per year meant maintaining massive swine operations somewhere in the agricultural hinterlands of London. And here's my favourite detail in its sheer extravagance. 53 wild boar. Not domesticated pigs, wild boar. These dangerous, aggressive animals that had to be hunted in the forest, often with packs of dogs and armed men. 53 successful boar hunts per year, just to add a touch of gamey wildness to the royal menu. Add all those numbers together, and you get 14,390 animals. But we're not done yet, because that's just the mammals. We haven't even touched poultry. The same account books record thousands upon thousands of birds consumed annually. Chickens by the hundreds, geese and ducks, game birds like pheasants, partridges and woodcock. The smaller the bird, the more you needed to make a meal, so the numbers for things like sparrows and larks reached into the tens of thousands. There are records of individual feasts consuming over 500 small birds in a single course, and remember what we discussed about fish days. Those weren't vegetarian days. They were just different protein days. So alongside all that meat consumption, you had equally enormous quantities of fish moving through the kitchens. Hundreds of pounds of cod, herring, salmon, plaice, barrels of salted fish. Live eels kept in tanks until needed. Oysters by the thousands. Lobsters, crabs, even the occasional sturgeon, which was so prized that by law it belonged to the crown and had to be offered to the monarch before anyone else could purchase it. Now let's talk about what you wash all that protein down with, because the liquid consumption is equally mind-boggling. Historical estimates suggest that Hampton Court Palace went through approximately 600,000 gallons of ale per year. 600,000 gallons! That's enough to fill an Olympic-sized swimming pool. Or if you prefer a different comparison, that's roughly 3 million pints of beer consumed annually at a single location. And that's just the ale, which was the common drink, the everyday beverage consumed by everyone from nobles to scullions. Wine was reserved for those higher up the social ladder. The palace consumed an estimated 75,000 gallons of wine each year. To put that in perspective, that's about 400,000 bottles in modern terms, enough to fill 1,500 bathtubs. And we're talking about imported wine shipped from France and Spain and the Rhineland at considerable expense and effort. Have you ever tried to imagine what 600,000 gallons of liquid looks like? Try this. Picture your house wherever you're lying right now listening to this. Now imagine every room filled floor to ceiling with ale. Your bedroom, your bathroom, your kitchen, your living room, every closet, every hallway, all of it just completely flooded with beer. That's roughly the volume we're discussing. Now imagine consuming all of it within 12 months. That's what the Tudor court did, year after year after year. The economic implications of this consumption level are staggering. Somebody had to raise those 14,000 animals, somebody had to transport them, somebody had to slaughter and butcher them, somebody had to preserve the meat that couldn't be eaten immediately, somebody had to brew all that ale and ship all that wine. We're talking about an entire economic ecosystem built around feeding one royal household. And Hampton Court wasn't Henry's only palace. He owned over 60 residences at the height of his power. Now, not all of them required this level of provisioning because the court didn't reside at all of them simultaneously. But several of his primary palaces, Whitehall, Greenwich, Windsor, maintained similar if slightly smaller household operations. When you start adding up the total agricultural output required to feed Tudor royal households across all their residents, the numbers become almost incomprehensible. There's a wonderful detail in Thomas Cromwell's letters. Cromwell was Henry's chief minister for many years, where he complains about the logistical nightmare of provisioning the court. He writes about needing to secure grazing rights for cattle across multiple counties, negotiating with vintners for reliable wine supplies, and dealing with brewers who couldn't keep up with demand. For Cromwell, managing the king's appetite was a full-time administrative challenge that consumed as much time and energy as managing foreign policy. And the costs. Oh, the costs. Feeding the royal household was one of the single largest expenses in the entire royal budget. Some historians estimate it consumed up to 30% of crown revenues, 30% of everything the king took in from taxes, rents, customs, duties and other sources went toward food. More than the military, more than building projects, more than the salaries of government officials. The king's stomach was the hungriest mouth in the entire realm. But here's what's really interesting about these numbers. They represent a fundamentally different relationship to food than what we have today. In our modern world, food is abundant. It's cheap, relatively speaking. Most people in developed nations spend less than 15% of their income on food, and we have access to varieties and quantities that would have been unimaginable to Tudor people. For the Tudors, especially the wealthy Tudors, food was the primary way to display status. You couldn't buy a luxury car. You couldn't take expensive vacations to exotic locations. You couldn't fill your house with the latest electronics. The ways to demonstrate wealth were limited: clothing, jewelry, housing, and food. And of those four, food was the most visceral, the most immediate, the most universally understood. When you served 14 courses at a banquet, when you offered guests a choice between 5 different roasted meats, when you had wine flowing and ale abundant and bread so fine it was whiter than snow, you were making a statement that anyone could understand regardless of their education or sophistication. This is power. This is success. This is what winning looks like. And the excess was intentional. You weren't supposed to eat everything. Remember, table manners dictated that you leave food on your plate. The whole point was abundance beyond need, generosity beyond consumption. The leftovers distributed to the poor at the palace gates weren't an unfortunate byproduct. They were part of the message. I have so much I can afford to give away what others would consider a feast. There's an economic term for this kind of consumption, conspicuous consumption, coined by sociologist Thorstein Veblen in the late 19th century, but describing a behavior that's probably as old as human civilization. You consume openly, excessively, wastefully, specifically so others can see you doing it. The consumption itself isn't the point. Being seen consuming is the point. The Tudors elevated conspicuous consumption to an art form. Those 14,000 animals weren't just food. They were a statement written in flesh and blood that said, I command resources on a scale you cannot imagine. I can kill and consume and waste, and it doesn't even make a dent in my wealth. I am so far above you in the social hierarchy that we might as well be different species, and it worked. Foreign ambassadors wrote home about the legendary English hospitality, the overwhelming abundance of Henry's table. Visiting dignitaries were impressed, intimidated, awed. Common people who received the leftover scraps told stories about the king's generosity. The whole system reinforced itself through collective participation in the myth of royal magnificence. But, and here's where it gets complicated, this massive consumption had real costs beyond the economic. The environmental impact alone was significant. Maintaining the agricultural capacity to produce this much meat required enormous amounts of land that couldn't be used for growing grain for bread, the staple food that most English people relied on. When the nobility claimed vast estates for deer parks and cattle grazing, that was land removed from productive agriculture for the broader population. There were periodic food crises in Tudor England, years when harvests failed and people starved. And during those crises, the nobility kept eating. The royal court's consumption didn't decrease because times were hard. If anything, maintaining the appearance of abundance became even more important during shortages because it demonstrated that the king was above such concerns, that his power transcended even nature's limitations. I sometimes wonder what those 14,000 animals thought, if animals think in ways we'd recognize. Did the oxen in the field understand where they were going when humans came to select them? Did the sheep sense their fate? Probably not in any conscious way we'd recognize, but there's something almost cosmically unjust about breeding creatures into existence solely to be consumed by humans who already had more than enough to eat. And yet, here's the paradox. That massive consumption supported thousands of jobs. Farmers raising animals, drovers moving them to market, butchers processing them, cooks preparing them. The entire economy of rural England was oriented around feeding London and the royal court. If Henry had suddenly decided to become vegetarian, the economic disruption would have been catastrophic. This is one of those historical moments where you can't simply apply modern values and call something good or bad. The excess was real, the waste was real, the environmental and social costs were real. But so were the livelihoods of the people who depended on that system. So was the cultural meaning attached to generous hospitality. So was the genuine pleasure people took in eating well and sharing food with others. One thing that strikes me about all these numbers is how carefully they were recorded. The Tudors were meticulous bookkeepers. Every animal slaughtered was logged. Every barrel of wine was counted. Every expenditure was noted in elaborate account books that survive to this day. They wanted to know exactly how much they were consuming, partly for budget management, but partly, I think, because the numbers themselves were impressive. 600,000 gallons of ale sounds more impressive than just saying we drink a lot. 14,000 animals quantifies excess in a way that makes it real, measurable, comparable. And those comparisons mattered because other noble households were doing their own calculations, trying to keep pace. If the king consumed 14,000 animals, perhaps a duke needed to consume at least 5,000 to maintain appropriate status. If Hampton Court went through 600,000 gallons of ale, maybe other grand houses aimed for 100,000. The numbers became targets, benchmarks, goals to strive toward. It was an arms race conducted through consumption, and like all arms races, it was ultimately unsustainable. The levels of excess reached during Henry's reign couldn't be maintained indefinitely. Later Tudor monarchs and early Stuart kings would try, but the economic strain eventually contributed to broader financial crises that had political consequences. You can't eat your way to national bankruptcy, but you can certainly contribute to it. So when we look at those numbers, 14,000 animals, 600,000 gallons of ale, 75,000 gallons of wine, we're not just seeing statistics, we're seeing the arithmetic of a world view, a way of understanding power and status and human worth that expresses itself through consumption. It's foreign to us in some ways, familiar in others. We don't slaughter oxen to prove we're successful, but we do buy things we don't need to impress people we don't like. The mechanism changes, the psychology doesn't. And now I want to shift our focus, because we've been talking about these massive numbers, these huge quantities, this overwhelming abundance. But we haven't really discussed what it was actually like to sit at one of these tables as food was served, the ritual of it, the ceremony, the incredibly specific rules about who ate what, who sat where, and how every gesture and movement communicated your place in the social order. Because eating at a Tudor feast wasn't just about consuming calories. It was about performing your identity, your status, your very right to exist in that space. And nowhere was that performance more carefully scripted than when the king himself was dining. There's something profoundly sad about eating alone. We're social creatures, aren't we? We gather around on tables with friends and family. We share meals. We talk and laugh and connect over food. It's one of the most basic human experiences, this communal breaking of bread. And yet, the most powerful man in England spent most of his meals in complete solitude. Not because he wanted to, well, maybe sometimes he wanted to, but primarily because protocol demanded it. Because the king wasn't just a person, he was an institution, a living symbol of divine authority, and institutions don't share their dinner with mere mortals. Let me take you through what it was actually like when Henry VIII sat down to eat, because the ritual is so elaborate, so precisely choreographed, that it tells us everything about how the Tudors understood power, proximity, and the unbridgeable gap between royalty and everyone else. The day's routine was governed by strict schedule. The king rose around 8 in the morning. He would pray privately, usually for about an hour, because Henry, despite his later break with Rome, considered himself deeply religious throughout his life. Then he'd dress, which wasn't a simple matter of pulling on clothes. It was a ceremony involving multiple servants, each with specific responsibilities. The yeoman of the wardrobe would bring freshly brushed garments to the door of the privy chamber and pass them to the groom of the stool. Yes, that was a real title, originally referring to the person who attended the king's close stool, which was the Tudor term for toilet, though the position evolved into a much broader role as the king's most intimate attendant. By 10 in the morning, the king was ready for dinner. Not breakfast. Remember, breakfast wasn't really a thing for most Tudors, including royalty. You broke your fast, that's where the word comes from, with your first substantial meal around mid-morning. Now, here's where it splits into two very different experiences depending on whether this was a public or private meal. Most days Henry ate privately in his chambers. A select few servants would be present. The groom of the stool, perhaps a page or two, maybe a trusted advisor if business needed discussing. The food would be brought from his private kitchen, prepared under John Brickett's supervision, carried through the palace corridors by servants who'd been carefully searched to ensure they weren't smuggling weapons or poison. The private meals were probably the most relaxed Henry ever got, which isn't saying much. Even alone, he ate carefully, deliberately, maintaining the dignity expected of a monarch. But at least he could eat at his own pace, choose what he wanted from the buffet spread before him, maybe actually enjoy his food rather than performing the act of eating. But several times a week, especially when important visitors were at court or when Henry wanted to remind everyone who was in charge, he would dine publicly in the presence chamber. And that's when the full weight of royal protocol descended. The presence chamber was a large, imposing room, high ceilings, tapestries on every wall depicting biblical scenes or classical myths or hunting triumphs, and dominating one end of the room there was a raised platform, literally elevated above the rest of the floor, upon which sat a single high-back chair under an elaborate canopy called the canopy of state. This canopy was made of rich fabric, often cloth of gold, embroidered with the royal coat of arms. It marked the space beneath it as sacred, as special, as separate from the ordinary world. Under that canopy, Henry would sit alone at his table. And I mean alone, not just at the head of a long table with others seated down its length. Completely alone. The nearest other human being would be standing at least 10 feet away. Before he could even sit down, there was a ceremony. A servant called the sewer, and we mentioned this role briefly before, but let me explain it more fully because it's fascinating, would approach carrying a large basin of warm water scented with rose petals or lavender. The sewer would kneel before the king and ceremonially wash Henry's hands after a quick rinse. A thorough, ritualized washing, drying them with fine linen towels that had been specially laundered and inspected. Why? Partly hygiene, sure, but mostly symbolism. The washing represented purification, the preparation of the king's body to receive sustenance. It set this meal apart from ordinary eating. It created a boundary between before and during, between the secular world and this sacred act of royal consumption. Only after his hands were washed could Henry sit. He would take his seat under the canopy, and then, only then, would food begin to arrive. And here's where it gets really specific. Every dish that came to the king's table had to be tasted first by the sewer or another designated servant. Not just a little nibble to check for poison, though that was certainly part of it. A proper taste. The servant would sample the food, wait a moment to ensure no immediate adverse effects, and only then would the dish be presented to Henry. Think about the psychological weight of that job. You're tasting the king's food, which sounds great until you remember that if someone has poisoned it, you die. Every meal could be your last. Every mouthful a gamble. The position came with good pay and high status, but you were literally putting your life on the line multiple times daily. Once a dish was tasted and approved, it would be placed on the table before Henry, not handed to him, placed. The server would approach, set it down carefully within the king's reach, and then retreat several steps. No one touched the king's food except the king himself. No one's hands could contaminate what royalty would consume. Henry would eat using that special fork we discussed, the only fork in the building for his sweet preserves. For everything else, he used his personal knife and his fingers. But here's what contemporary accounts emphasize. He ate neatly, delicately. He would cut small pieces of meat, bring them to his mouth without dripping or spilling, chew thoroughly, and wipe his mouth frequently with the napkin that was draped over his left shoulder. There's a wonderful detail in a letter from a French ambassador who attended one of these public dinners. He writes with some surprise that the King of England ate more like a scholar at study than a warrior at feast. He noted Henry's careful manners, his deliberate pace, the way he seemed almost distracted, as if eating was a duty he was performing rather than a pleasure he was enjoying. And maybe it was, because while Henry ate, everyone else stood. The presence chamber would be full of courtiers, dozens, sometimes over 100 people, all standing in silent observation while the king consumed his meal. They couldn't eat. They couldn't sit. They could barely move. They just stood there, watching, their presence serving as audience to this performance of power. Can you imagine that? Being hungry, smelling all that delicious food, watching someone eat course after course while you're not allowed even a bite. The cruelty of it is almost breathtaking. But that was the point. The king's ability to eat while others went hungry, to be satisfied while others waited, was a demonstration of his fundamental difference from common humanity. The napkin placement is a detail I love because it's so specific and so revealing. In Tudor dining etiquette, you placed your napkin on your left shoulder, not on your lap as we do today. Why the shoulder? Because your lap was considered a private area, and drawing attention to it was impolite. The shoulder was public, visible, acceptable. So the napkin went there, and if you needed to wipe your mouth or your fingers, you'd pull it from your shoulder, use it, and replace it. But there were even more rules. No elbows on the table, ever. That was considered the height of rudeness, suggesting laziness or lack of control. You kept your elbows at your sides, using only your forearms to manipulate food and cup. No fists on the table either, for similar reasons. An open hand resting lightly was acceptable. A closed fist suggested aggression or tension. You could wipe your nose on your sleeve. That was perfectly fine, which seems bizarre to us, but made sense to them since sleeves were external garments that would be washed. But you absolutely could not scratch your head at the table, and you definitely could not pick your nose. Both were considered disgusting violations of dining decorum. There's actually a Tudor conduct manual that spends several paragraphs explaining why head scratching and nose picking are unacceptable at meals, which suggests people needed to be told this frequently. And here's my favourite rule. If you needed to spit, which was apparently a common occurrence given the way meat was prepared, the prevalence of gristle and bone fragments, you had to do it discreetly into a napkin or handkerchief. You couldn't just spit on the floor, though in many contexts that was acceptable. The dining chamber was special. It required restraint. All of these rules applied to everyone dining at court, but they applied most strictly to the king because everyone was watching him. His behaviour set the standard. If he slouched, courtiers might feel emboldened to slouch. If he ate sloppily, others might become sloppy. The king had to embody perfect manners at all times because the social order depended on his example. But back to the presence chamber. While Henry ate his meal in silence, and it really was mostly silent, conversation was minimal during public dining. Servants would circulate among the standing courtiers, offering wine or ale, not food, just drink, just enough to keep people from fainting or leaving, but not enough to satisfy hunger. You were there to witness, not to partake. The meal would typically last about an hour. Multiple courses would be brought out, presented to the king, tasted, consumed or ignored, based on his preference. Remember what we said before about the buffet-style service? Henry would choose what he wanted from the options presented. He might eat heartily from some dishes and barely touch others. Whatever remained would eventually be cleared away and distributed to servants or the poor. But while he was dining, the food was his alone. And then there were the eavesdroppers. I mentioned these briefly before, but let me explain them properly, because they're such a perfect encapsulation of Tudor paranoia and control. The Great Hall at Hampton Court has these carved wooden faces on the ceiling, positioned to look down at the dining tables below. They're called eavesdroppers, and they served as a constant reminder that someone might be listening. Were there actually people hidden in the ceiling spying on conversations? Probably not regularly, though the very fact that people wondered suggests it wasn't impossible. But the psychological effect was real. When you sat down to eat in the Great Hall, you saw those faces staring at you and you remembered, be careful what you say. Someone is always watching. Someone is always listening. Even here, perhaps especially here, you're not safe. It's such a deeply Tudor approach to power, not just exercising control, but making people internalize that control, making them police their own behavior out of fear of unseen observers. Now, most courtiers didn't eat in the presence chamber with the king. They ate in the Great Hall or the Great Watching Chamber, depending on their rank. These were communal meals, served at long tables where people sat according to strict hierarchy. The highest-ranking nobles sat closest to the high table at the front of the room. Lesser nobles sat further back. Knights and gentlemen sat further still. And servants entitled to meals, remember not all servants had that right, sat at the very back or in adjacent rooms. The food quality varied by position too. Those at the high table received the same multi-course meals the king enjoyed, just in slightly smaller portions and less elaborate presentations. Mid-level courtiers got good food, but simpler preparations and fewer choices. Lower-ranking people got basic but adequate fare. Bread, ale, meat, vegetables, nothing fancy but enough to sustain you. And the portions were carefully controlled. Meals were served in messes, portions designed to be shared among 4 people. You didn't get your own individual plate of food. You got access to a communal dish that you and 3 others would eat from together. This encouraged social bonds among people of similar rank, while also making portion control easier for the kitchen staff. Your messmates mattered. Who you shared food with said something about your status and your relationships. If you were placed in a mess with important people, that was a sign of favour. If you found yourself demoted to a mess with lower-ranking individuals, you had better figure out what you did wrong because someone was sending you a message. The etiquette for eating from a shared mess was complex. You couldn't just grab the best pieces for yourself. You had to wait your turn, take approximately equal portions, leave the choicest bits for the highest-ranking person at your mess. There were probably dozens of subtle social calculations happening at every meal. Who reached first, who took what, who deferred to whom. The dining hall was a constant negotiation of status and favour, with food as the medium of exchange. And above it all, governing everything, was the knowledge that your access to these meals could be revoked at any moment. The bouche of court that right to free meals was a privilege granted by the king. It could be taken away as punishment. If you fell out of favour, you might suddenly find yourself without meal rights, forced to provide your own food or leave court entirely. The threat of exclusion from the royal table was a powerful tool of control. So every meal reinforced the hierarchy. Every seating arrangement, every mess assignment, every course served or withheld, every moment of access or denial, all of it communicated your place in the social order. You didn't need to be told you'd been demoted. You could see it in where you sat and what you ate. But there's something almost tragic about the king's position in this system. Yes, he had the most power. Yes, he ate the best food from the finest plate under the most elaborate canopy, but he ate alone. He was surrounded by people and utterly isolated. He couldn't relax, he couldn't let his guard down. Every bite was performed for an audience that watched his every move, looking for signs of favour or disfavour, analysing his mood based on how much venison he consumed. The loneliness of absolute power is a cliché, but sitting here thinking about Henry eating meal after meal under that canopy of state, performing the simple human act of nourishing his body while hundreds of eyes watched and judged and calculated, it feels real. He was the most important person in the room and the most alone. And as he aged, as his body grew larger and his health deteriorated, the isolation must have become even more acute. Those final years when he often ate in bed, attended only by his most trusted servants, away from prying eyes. Was that a relief? Or just a different kind of loneliness? The isolation of illness rather than ceremony? I think about the contrast between public and private dining and what it reveals about the dual nature of kingship. In public, Henry was the performance, the symbol, the living embodiment of royal authority. In private, he was just a man eating dinner, probably wishing his leg didn't hurt so much, maybe wanting someone to actually talk to rather than just serve him. But even in private, even in his bedchamber with only a handful of servants present, he was never really just a man. He was always the king. The rituals might be simplified, the audience smaller, but the fundamental separation remained. Between him and everyone else, between the sacred and the ordinary, between the lonely pinnacle of power and the communal warmth of human connection. And this brings us to something we really need to address, because we've spent all this time talking about what the king ate, what the nobles ate, what the upper ranks of court consumed, but what about everyone else? What about the 200 people working in those 55 kitchen rooms? What about the servants who stood in the great hall but weren't allowed to sit? What did they eat? Where did they eat it? What was life like on the other side of this elaborate hierarchy? That's the world we're diving into now, the reality behind the spectacle, the people who made the feast possible but rarely got to enjoy it. Every system has two faces, what you see and what makes it work. We've been looking at the visible face of Tudor feasting, the gilded peacocks, the rivers of wine, the king under his canopy. But now let me show you the invisible machinery, the people who made all of that possible but lived in a completely different world, sometimes just a wall's thickness away from all that abundance. There were 230 servants at Hampton Court entitled to receive food as part of their employment. 230 people who worked at the palace, who made the whole operation function, but who didn't have permission to eat in the great hall where the courtiers dined. Think about that phrase for a moment. Entitled to receive food. Not invited to dine. not welcome to the feast, entitled to rations, like soldiers in a garrison. The surviving account books are remarkably specific about what these servants received. There's a document beautifully preserved despite being nearly 500 years old that lists the daily menu for what it calls maids, servants, children of offices, porters and scourers. I love that they included scourers, the people who scrubbed pots, right there in the official records. Even the lowest jobs were accounted for, categorized, allocated their portion. The menu is brutally simple: bread, ale, beefy and veal or mutton. That's it. Twice a day, every day. No variety, no choices, no peacocks in their feathers or sugar castles or gilded swan beaks. Just bread, ale and whatever meat was available. Sometimes beef and veal, sometimes mutton, depending on what the kitchens were processing that day and what portions could be spared from noble consumption. But here's what's interesting. That simple menu was actually pretty decent by Tudor standards. Better than what most people outside the palace gates were eating. The average labourer in London, the farmer in the countryside, the craftsman in his workshop, they were lucky to get meat once a week. Their daily fare was pottage, that thick vegetable and grain porridge we've mentioned before, supplemented with bread and ale when they could afford it. So even though the servants were at the bottom of the palace hierarchy, they were eating better than the majority of English people. They had access to fresh meat regularly, not just the salted or preserved stuff that most people relied on. Their bread, while not the fancy white man shape the nobles enjoyed, was still proper wheat bread, not the coarse rye and barley mixture that was standard peasant fare. And the quantities were adequate. Each servant received enough food to maintain their health and energy for the demanding physical labour they performed. The palace couldn't afford to have workers collapsing from malnutrition. That bread, ale and meat represented a genuine benefit, a reason why people competed for positions at court even when the work was brutal and the hours endless. But where did they eat it? That's the part that really brings home the inequality of the system. Most of these servants didn't have a dining room. They didn't have tables set with napkins and cups. Many of them ate in the kitchens where they worked, perched on stools or barrels or just sitting on the floor, plates balanced on their laps. Some ate in their sleeping quarters, cramped little rooms tucked into corners of the palace complex, often shared by multiple people. A few ate outside in the courtyards when weather permitted, grateful for fresh air after hours in the smoke-filled kitchens. The meal was served in those messes we discussed earlier, portions for 4 people. So you'd get your chunk of bread, your share of the meat, your measure of ale, and you'd find 3 colleagues to share with. Maybe the same 3 people every day, forming a little family unit within the larger household. Or maybe it rotated, the composition of your mess depending on who was working which shift and who had time to eat when. There was no ceremony, no sewer washing your hands, no tasting for poison, no one watching to ensure you demonstrated proper etiquette. You grabbed your food during whatever brief window you had between tasks, you ate it as quickly as you could, and you got back to work. Eating wasn't a social event or a status performance. It was fuel, nothing more. And here's a detail that really illustrates the divide. Servants were expected to finish their food. Remember how we talked about how nobles were required by etiquette to leave food on their plates? That rule didn't apply to servants. If you were allocated a portion, you ate it all. Waste was your enemy, not your privilege. The leftovers that nobles so generously distributed to the poor at the gates, those came from noble tables, not servant rations. But there was a strange dignity in that simplicity, wasn't there? No performance required, no one judging your table manners, no complicated rules about which hand to use or where to place your napkin. You were just people eating food, the most basic human activity, stripped of all the elaborate meaning that the nobility had draped over it. Some servants, particularly those working the longest shifts in the kitchens, would eat 3 or even 4 times during their workday. Not full meals, just quick portions grabbed between tasks. A chunk of bread here, a piece of meat there, cup of ale to wash away the dust and smoke. The kitchens always had food around, and the workers were permitted to help themselves within reason. No one wanted the staff fainting from hunger in the middle of preparing a royal banquet. And that small beer we mentioned earlier, it was everywhere in the servant quarters, barrels of it, constantly being tapped and refilled. The beer served two purposes, hydration and calories. In that era, before clean water was reliably available, despite Hampton Court's spring-fed supply, beer was safer to drink than water from most sources. The brewing process killed bacteria that would have made you sick, and the small beer with its lower alcohol content kept you hydrated without getting you drunk. Though I'm sure some servants did get drunk. How could they not? Working 18-hour days in hellish conditions, bodies aching, hands scarred and burned, knowing that upstairs people were eating off gold plates while you're sitting on the kitchen floor with a wooden bowl, you'd probably drink too. The Spanish visitor who noted that English kitchens ran on copious amounts of beer probably wasn't wrong. A gentle buzz might have been the only thing that made the work bearable. Let me tell you about one specific person, because I think individual stories illuminate the system better than general descriptions. There's a record in the Hampton Court accounts of a kitchen maid named Alice Ward, employed in 1533. We don't know much about her. She wasn't important enough to feature in letters or chronicles, but the payroll records tell us a few things. Alice worked in the pastry department, probably helping to make the thousands of pie crusts the kitchens produced daily. Her wage was 4p per day, which comes out to about 10 shillings per month. For context, a skilled craftsman might earn twice that, while a labourer might earn half. Alice was somewhere in the middle, not well paid but not destitute. But her real compensation was that daily ration: bread, ale, meat. If she'd had to purchase that food herself, it would have cost more than her wages. So the food provision was actually the majority of her income. Without it, she couldn't afford to eat and pay for lodging. With it, she could even save a little money, maybe accumulate enough for a dowry someday, improve her marriage prospects. Alice lived in a small room adjacent to the pastry department. The record notes it as a chamber shared with 3 other women, all pastry workers. 4 women in a space probably no larger than your average modern bathroom. They slept on straw mattresses, shared whatever few possessions they owned, and spent their waking hours either working or too exhausted to do anything but sleep. Did Alice enjoy the food she ate? Did she savour her bread and meat? Or was she too tired to taste it? Did she dream about someday eating in the Great Hall? Or had she accepted that this was her place in the world? We'll never know. She exists in the records only as a name, a wage, a ration allocation. But she was real. She lived and worked and ate in those kitchens, her hands shaping pastry dough that would be filled with expensive meats and served to people who never wondered who made their dinner. The male servants had it slightly different, and in some ways worse. Many of them didn't even have assigned sleeping quarters. They camped in the kitchens, literally bedding down on the floor near the fireplaces after the day's work was done. Henry VIII eventually had to issue that ordinance we mentioned earlier, demanding that servants stop sleeping on the kitchen floors and stop working naked or nearly naked due to the heat. But where else could they go? The palace didn't provide dormitories. If you wanted proper housing, you had to pay for it yourself, and most servants couldn't afford lodging on their wages. So they slept where they worked, wrapped in whatever blankets they owned, the smell of smoke and meat and spilled ale their constant companion. It was like living on a battlefield, one historian wrote. The kitchens never truly stopped. There was always a fire burning somewhere, always someone on duty to tend it and keep it from going out. The overnight staff would sleep in shifts, some tending fires while others rested, rotating through the night. The distinction between workspace and living space dissolved completely. Your job was your life in the most literal sense. And yet, and this is crucial, this was still better than the alternatives available to most people. A position at a court, even at the lowest level, meant security, regular meals, shelter, a place in a larger community, the chance, however slim, of advancement. Maybe you'd start as a scullion at age 12, scrubbing pots for pennies. But if you worked hard, if you were smart and lucky, maybe you become a groom by 20, a yeoman by 30, perhaps eventually a sergeant supervising others. It was a ladder you could climb, which is more than most Tudor jobs offered. And there were perks beyond the food. Servants at royal palaces received cast-off clothing from the nobles. Not the fancy stuff, those garments were too valuable and would be sold or repurposed. But the everyday items, the things that were worn or slightly damaged, would filter down through the hierarchy until they reached the servants. A pair of shoes that no longer fit a courtier might find their way to a kitchen worker. A cloak with a small tear might become a servant's prized possession. At Christmas and other major holidays, there were bonuses, extra rations, sometimes a small monetary gift. The king, in his role as generous father to his household, would ensure that even the lowest servants received something special on feast days. It wasn't charity, it was part of the social contract. The king takes care of his people, and in return they serve him loyally. But the daily reality was still grinding, labour punctuated by basic meals eaten in snatched moments of rest. And the awareness, the constant inescapable awareness, that just through that door, up those stairs, in that hall, people were living completely differently, eating differently, existing in a world of abundance and choice that you would never access no matter how hard you worked or how loyal you were. Does that breed resentment? You'd think so, wouldn't you? But the historical record suggests that most servants accepted the hierarchy as natural, even divinely ordained. The social order was what it was. You were born into your station. The best you could hope for was to rise within your level, not to jump to a different level entirely. A scullion could become a sergeant, but a servant could never become a nobleman. That transformation was simply impossible in the Tudor worldview. And many servants seemed genuinely proud of their positions. They worked for the king, they were part of the royal household. They had stories to tell when they visited family in the countryside. I work at Hampton Court, I prepare food for the king himself. Never mind that the king would never know your name, never acknowledge your existence. You were still part of something grand, something historic. That mattered. There's a psychological phenomenon we still see today. People who work for prestigious institutions, even in menial roles, often identify with the institution's prestige. The janitor at Harvard feels a connection to Harvard's reputation. The cook at a famous restaurant basks in the restaurant's glory. The Tudor servants were doing the same thing. They were palace servants, royal household members, and that distinction elevated them above other workers even if their material conditions weren't much better. But I keep coming back to the food itself. That simple ration, bread, ale, beef and veal, or mutton, twice a day, every day. It was adequate, it was sustaining, it was profoundly, almost aggressively boring. No spices to speak of, no variety, no surprises. You knew exactly what you'd be eating today because it was exactly what you ate yesterday and what you'd eat again this coming week. Compare that to the nobles eating just a few rooms away, choosing from 14 different dishes, sampling exotic game and imported delicacies and elaborate sugar creations. The class divide wasn't just about wealth, it was about choice, about variety, about the simple freedom to decide what you wanted to eat on any given day. And here's what strikes me as both beautiful and terrible. Both groups were being fed by the same system. The same kitchens prepared the gilded peacock and the servant's mutton. The same stores supplied both tables. The same Hampton Court budget paid for both experiences. But the outcomes couldn't have been more different. It's a perfect microcosm of how power works, isn't it? Not through absolute deprivation, the servants weren't starving. Through differential access to abundance. You see the wealth, you help create it, you know it exists, but you can never quite reach it. It's always just beyond your grasp. Always reserved for people whose bloodlines or good fortune place them in a different category of human being. And that brings us to something we really need to examine, because we've been dancing around this topic for a while now. We've talked about religious fasting laws and theological loopholes, but we haven't really dug into the absurdity, the creativity, the sometimes desperate reasoning that people employed to follow the letter of the law while violating its spirit. We touched on beaver tails earlier, but there's a whole universe of strange justifications and bizarre culinary theology that deserves exploration. And beyond that, there are the dishes themselves, the actual food created for fast days that push the boundaries of what fish could mean. That's our next destination, the strange, inventive, sometimes revolting world of Tudor fast day cuisine and the mental gymnastics required to call it acceptable. Sometimes the strangest truths hide the most innocent questions, like this one. What do you get when you sew the front half of a pig to the back half of a chicken? The answer, in Tudor England, was dinner. And not just dinner. Entertainment, conversation piece, theological statement, and proof that humans will do absolutely anything to make eating more complicated than it needs to be. Welcome to the world of the cockentrice, perhaps the single most bizarre creation to ever emerge from a Tudor kitchen. And trust me, that's saying something given everything else we've discussed. The cockentrice, sometimes spelled cockentrice or cockentry depending on which medieval cookbook you're reading, was exactly what it sounds like. You take a pig, butcher it carefully to preserve the front half intact. You take a capon, which is a castrated rooster that's been fattened for eating, and preserve its back half. Then you'd literally stitch them together using kitchen twine or wire, creating a chimera, a monster, something that had never existed in nature but now existed on your plate. Why? That's the question that haunts me about so much of Tudor food culture. Why go to all this trouble? The pig and the chicken both taste fine on their own. Combining them doesn't improve the flavour. If anything, it probably makes both worse because they require different cooking times and temperatures. The front half of a pig needs to roast longer than the back half of a chicken, which means one part will inevitably be overcooked or undercooked. But flavour wasn't the point. It never was. The cockentrice was theatre. It was a conversation starter. It was a way to make your guests uncomfortable, intrigued, amazed, maybe slightly horrified. When servants carried that thing into the banquet hall, this impossible creature that was part barnyard, part fantasy, all grotesque, everyone stopped talking. Everyone stared, and then everyone started debating what it meant. Because in medieval and Tudor culture, everything meant something. Symbols were everywhere, and educated people spent enormous amounts of time parsing them. So a cockentrice wasn't just a weird food hybrid. It was a statement about the relationship between earth and air, between the terrestrial and the celestial, between different elements that shouldn't coexist but did through human ingenuity. The pig represented earth, grounded, low, wallowing in mud, eating slop. The chicken represented air, flying creatures, closer to heaven, eating grain which was a gift from God. Joining them together was a demonstration of human power over nature. We can take two separate orders of creation and merge them into one. We are not bound by natural law. We can remake the world according to our imagination. Pretty heavy symbolism for something you're going to eat with your fingers, right? But the Tudors loved this kind of layered meaning. And they weren't alone. Medieval banquets across Europe featured similar hybrid creatures. There are recipes for boar turkeys, where the front of a boar would be joined to the back of a large bird. Duck rabbits, fish-fowl combinations that made absolutely no culinary sense but looked spectacular on a platter. The preparation was incredibly labour-intensive. You'd roast the two halves separately first, because as I mentioned, they needed different cooking times. Then you'd let them cool enough to handle. The stitching had to be done carefully. You didn't want your cochintrice falling apart during presentation. Some cooks would use beaten egg whites as a kind of glue to help hold the seam together. Others would wrap the whole thing in pastry dough and bake it one more time, creating a unified crust that hid the join. And then there was the garnishing. You couldn't just present a stitched-together pig-chicken monstrosity without some decorative elements. Cooks would gild certain parts with gold leaf. They'd add elaborate sauce work around the base of the platter. Sometimes they'd surround the cochintrice with smaller normal birds or fruits, creating a kind of tableau that told a story. I've seen illuminated manuscripts from the period showing cochintrice presentations, and they're genuinely unsettling. The artist drew these creatures with surprising realism, which makes them more disturbing somehow. If they'd been stylized or cartoonish, it might feel whimsical. But when you see a detailed illustration of what really looks like a pig's head and shoulders seamlessly joined to a chicken's legs and tail, something in your brain protests. This isn't right. This violates the order of things. And that violation was precisely the point. Banquets were supposed to transport you out of the everyday. They were supposed to show you things you'd never seen before, couldn't see anywhere else. A cochintrice did that. It broke reality just a little bit. Just enough to remind you that in this space, under this roof, at this table, normal rules didn't apply. But the cochintrice wasn't even the strangest example of Tudor culinary creativity when it came to combining disparate elements. There were pies, and I need you to really hear this, that contained live animals. Animals inside pies. The most famous example is the 4 and 20 blackbirds baked in a pie from the nursery rhyme. You know the one, sing a song of sixpence, a pocket full of rye, 4 and 20 blackbirds baked in a pie. When the pie was opened, the birds began to sing. Wasn't that a dainty dish to set before the king? We think of that as a nonsense rhyme, a children's song with meaningless lyrics. But it's describing a real thing that actually happened at Tudor banquets. Cooks would create an enormous pie with a hollow centre. They'd bake it empty first so the crust was fully cooked and structural. Then, just before presentation, they'd fill the hollow centre with live birds, sometimes blackbirds, sometimes doves, sometimes even more exotic species if the host was really showing off. The pie would be carried into the hall and placed before an important guest, often the highest-ranking person present. Then a servant would cut into the top crust and the birds would burst out, flying around the room, causing chaos and delight in equal measure. Nobles would shriek and laugh, ladies would cover their hair, men would try to catch the birds. It was pandemonium, it was magnificent. Can you imagine planning that? The timing had to be perfect. Put the birds in too early and they'd die from heat or lack of air. Too late and you'd have to interrupt the flow of the meal to stuff birds into a pie in front of everyone. You'd need someone backstage with a cage full of birds waiting for the exact right moment. And you'd need birds that were calm enough to stay quiet inside a dark pie crust until it was opened, then energetic enough to fly out dramatically. It was a magic trick, essentially. Culinary prestidigitation. And like all good magic, it required extensive preparation to create a moment of spontaneous wonder. But there were other variations on the surprise pie theme. Some would contain live frogs. Imagine cutting into what you think is a savoury meat pie and having frogs leap out at you. The shock value must have been incredible. Other pies reportedly contained rabbits, though I have a hard time picturing how you'd fit a live rabbit into a pie without it thrashing and ruining the crust. These weren't for eating, obviously. The live animal pies were purely entertainment. After the excitement died down and the birds or frogs or whatever were recaptured or escaped out windows, servants would bring out actual food pies for consumption. But the performance came first. And speaking of performances, there were elaborate sugar constructions we touched on earlier. But I want to tell you about one specific example that really illustrates how far the Tudors would go. At a banquet held in 1527 to honour visiting French ambassadors, the centrepiece was a sugar sculpture depicting the entire city of London. Not a simplified version. A detailed, architecturally accurate model showing the Tower of London, London Bridge with its houses and shops, St. Paul's Cathedral, the Thames River represented in tinted blue sugar, even tiny sugar boats on the water. This thing was enormous. Contemporary accounts say it was nearly 6 feet long and 3 feet wide. It took a team of confectioners over 2 weeks to create, working with hundreds of pounds of sugar, marzipan, and various coloured pastes. And the level of detail was obsessive. Individual windows on buildings, miniature people crossing the bridge, flags flying from tower tops, each one accurately representing the actual banners that would have flown there. The Sugar London sat in the centre of the banquet table for the entire meal. Guests could walk around it, examining the craftsmanship, identifying specific landmarks, debating whether the proportions were accurate. It was art, it was architecture, it was civic pride. And at the end of the evening it was systematically destroyed as guests took pieces to eat, breaking off towers and bridges and carrying away sections of the city in their mouths. There's something almost violent about that, isn't there? This beautiful, painstaking creation exists for a few hours and then gets consumed, destroyed, erased. The Sugar London never existed except in that moment at that banquet, witnessed by those specific people. It couldn't be preserved, couldn't be photographed, couldn't be visited by future generations. It was as ephemeral as the meal itself. That ephemerality was part of the appeal. These creations were more precious because they were temporary. You had to be there. You couldn't experience them second-hand, and that made the invitation to witness them more valuable. But back to the grotesque and bizarre. There was something called a helmeted cock, which was a roasted chicken presented wearing a miniature suit of armour, crafted from silver or pewter. The armour would be jointed so it actually fit the bird's proportions, complete with tiny gauntlets on the legs and a helmet on the head with a movable visor. Someone had to measure the chicken, design custom armour, craft it in metal, and then dress a dead bird in it for presentation. The amount of effort this required is staggering. And for what? A momentary surprise when the dish was unveiled. A few laughs about the martial chicken, maybe some conversation about chivalry and honour, and how even a humble barnyard bird could be elevated through association with knightly symbols. Or consider the swans we've mentioned, presented in their feathers with gold crowns. But some cooks went further. They'd position the swan so it appeared to be attacking something, maybe a sugar castle, maybe other smaller birds arranged to look like they were fleeing. The scene would tell a story. The noble swan defending its territory, or conquering lesser creatures, or whatever narrative the host wanted to convey, because that's what all of this was really about, storytelling through food. Every dish was a narrative, every presentation carried meaning. You weren't just serving dinner, you were creating a multi-course epic where each chapter arrived on a platter, where the plot unfolded through increasingly elaborate visual spectacles, where the climax might be a pie exploding with birds or a peacock breathing fire, or a sugar city being devoured by your guests. The Tudor feast was immersive theatre before that term existed. You weren't watching a play, you were inside it, you were part of it, You were consuming it literally and metaphorically. The boundary between audience and performer dissolved when you could reach out and take a piece of the set design and eat it. And the cooks, the confectioners, the artists who created these spectacles, they were anonymous. We don't know most of their names. They weren't celebrated as chefs are today. They were servants, skilled servants certainly, but servants nonetheless. Their masterpieces existed for hours and then vanished. No portfolios, no Instagram accounts, no cookbooks with their names on the cover. Just fleeting moments of wonder that live now only in written descriptions and the occasional illustration. There's a melancholy to that. So much human creativity, so much skill and imagination and effort, all poured into creations designed to be destroyed. Was it worth it? Would those craftsmen say their lives were well spent creating sugar cities and bird-filled pies and impossible hybrid creatures? I don't know, but I suspect some of them found genuine satisfaction in the work, in solving the technical challenges, in seeing the moment when a noble gasped at their creation, in knowing that their Sugar London, or their helmeted cock, or their perfectly balanced cockatrice would be talked about for weeks, maybe years. They created memories. That's not nothing. But beyond the spectacle, beyond the theatre, there was still the fundamental question we haven't fully answered. What did all this excess actually mean? Not symbolically, not artistically, but practically, economically, socially. What were the real consequences of a food culture built on this kind of extravagance? And that's what we need to examine now, because the Tudor approach to feasting didn't exist in a vacuum. It had ripple effects throughout English society, effects that shaped law, economics, and the very structure of the social order. That's where we're heading next, into the rules and regulations that tried to control this excess, the governmental attempts to limit who could eat what, and the fascinating ways those attempts both succeeded and failed. When a government decides your dinner is a matter of national security, you know you're living in interesting times. In 1526, Henry VIII's chief advisor, Cardinal Thomas Wolsey, drafted a document that would fundamentally reshape how the royal household consumed food. It was called the Eltham Ordinances, named after Eltham Palace, where Wolsey hammered out the details, and it represented one of the most ambitious attempts in English history to regulate appetite through bureaucracy. The document is extraordinary. It's nearly 70 pages of meticulously detailed instructions covering every aspect of court life, but a huge portion, maybe a third of the entire thing, deals exclusively with food. Who gets to eat what? When they get to eat it, how much they're allowed, who pays for it, how it should be transported, stored, prepared and served. Reading it today feels like examining the operating manual for a machine designed to transform money and livestock into social hierarchy. But let's back up, because understanding why this document was necessary tells us so much about just how out of control Tudor feasting had become by the mid-1520s. Hampton Court Palace in 1526 housed approximately 1,200 people when the court was a full residence. 1,200 mouths to feed, twice a day, every day. But here's the problem. Not all of those people were supposed to be there. Over the years, as the court had grown, people had figured out ways to game the system. Distant relatives of courtiers would show up claiming household rights. Servants brought their own servants, who somehow ended up on the palace feeding lists. Random hangers-on would attach themselves to noble entourages, and suddenly they're eating free meals at the king's expense. It had become a financial disaster. The royal household expenses were spiralling out of control, and a significant chunk of those expenses were food-related. So Wolsey, who was nothing if not efficient, decided to impose order through regulation. The Eltham Ordinances would establish once and for all exactly who was entitled to eat at court and exactly what they could expect to receive. The document created what it called the Bouche of Corps, which we've mentioned several times but haven't fully explained. Bouche is French for mouth, so this was literally the mouth of court, the official list of people entitled to food. And it was shockingly specific. Every single position at court was assigned a precise daily food allocation, not approximate, not flexible. Exact quantities written down in official documents that would be enforced by supervisors called clerks of the green cloth, who maintained elaborate account books tracking every morsel consumed. Let me give you some examples of how specific this got. A duke eating at court was entitled to, per day, 1 loaf of fine manchette bread weighing exactly 2 pounds, 1 gallon of ale, 1 serving of wine, a first-course portion from the main meal that included a choice of boiled beef, roasted mutton or venison, plus a side of boiled chicken, a second-course portion that might include veal, pork or fish, depending on the day, plus what they called a voix du pois, random additional items like fruit, cheese or nuts. A knight received less, a gentleman less still, a yeoman got even less. By the time you reached the level of grooms and pages, you were down to the bread, ale and meat rations we discuss for servants, with no choices and no extras. And here's what's really interesting. If you were entitled to a meal but didn't show up to eat it, you didn't just lose your food. You lost your whole day's allocation, including the candles and firewood you would have received. The system wasn't flexible. You couldn't save up portions or transfer them to someone else. It was use it or lose it every single day. Why so rigid? Because Wolsey understood human nature. If you made the system flexible, people would exploit it. They'd claim double portions or take food for friends or sell their allocations. Rigidity prevented corruption, or at least it tried to, but the Eltham Ordinances went even further. They didn't just regulate what court members could eat, they regulated what the nobility across England could serve at their own tables in their own homes. This is where we get into sumptuary laws, which are some of the most fascinating and ultimately futile attempts at social engineering in history. In 1517, 9 years before the Eltham Ordinances, Parliament had passed a law attempting to limit what they called the excessive fares of the nobility. The stated purpose was to prevent waste and encourage moderation. The real purpose was to maintain social distinctions and prevent wealthy merchants from eating like aristocrats. The law established explicit limits on the number of dishes that could be served per course based on your rank. And these weren't suggestions, these were legal requirements with actual penalties for violation. A cardinal, and remember Wolsey himself was a cardinal, so he was literally writing rules that applied to him, could serve 9 dishes per course, not 8, not 10, exactly 9. A duke, earl or bishop could serve 7 dishes. A lord with an annual income over £500 could serve 6 dishes. Gentlemen was limited to 3. Now, what constituted a dish? That's where it gets clever and also ridiculous. Dish was defined by the type and size of animal. 1 swan or 1 peacock counted as 1 dish. 4 smaller birds like chickens or ducks counted as 1 dish. 12 very small birds like sparrows or larks counted as 1 dish. So if you were a gentleman limited to 3 dishes, you could theoretically serve 3 swans, or 12 chickens, or 36 larks. The law controlled variety, not quantity. Do you see the absurdity already built into this? It's like modern restaurant regulations that define portion sizes by number of items rather than weight. You could technically comply with the letter of the law while completely violating its spirit. A clever cook working for a clever nobleman could create a feast within these restrictions that was still overwhelming in its abundance. And there were exceptions. Weddings were exempt from the dish limitations, so if you wanted to throw a truly lavish feast, you just had to make sure someone was getting married at it. Suddenly those 9-dish limits no longer applied, and you could serve whatever you wanted. Also, if you were hosting someone of higher rank than yourself, You could serve food appropriate to their status rather than yours. So a gentleman hosting a duke could serve 7 dishes instead of 3. This exception was supposed to encourage hospitality, but it also created opportunities for showing off. Noblemen would strategically invite higher-ranking guests specifically so they could justify more elaborate meals. The enforcement of these laws was sporadic at best. Who was checking how many dishes were served at a private dinner party? Unless you had enemies who would report you, or unless you were so flagrant in your violations that it became public scandal, you could probably get away with quite a lot. The laws were more symbolic than practical, a statement about how society should work rather than an effective mechanism for making it work that way. But back to the Eltham Ordinances and the royal household where enforcement was much more rigorous. Wolsey created a whole bureaucratic apparatus to manage food consumption. The Lord Steward oversaw the entire operation. Below him were the clerks of the green cloth, who maintained the account books and tracked expenditures. Below them were supervisors for each department of the kitchen complex, each responsible for their specific domain, and everyone had to account for everything. If the flesh larder received 10 sides of beef on Monday, someone had to track where each one went. How much went to the king's private kitchen? How much to the great kitchen for courtier meals? How much to servant rations? Any discrepancy had to be explained. Any waste had to be justified. It was brilliant in its comprehensiveness and probably exhausting to maintain. Can you imagine the paperwork, the daily reports, the weekly summaries, the monthly reconciliations? Someone's entire job was sitting at a desk with a quill and an account book writing down every loaf of bread that entered and exited the larders. But it worked, at least partially. After the Eltham Ordinances were implemented, royal household food expenses decreased by roughly 20%. That's a massive savings when you're talking about the kind of money required to feed over 1,000 people daily. Wolsey had achieved his goal of imposing fiscal discipline on the court's appetite. However, he did it at a cost. The ordinances were deeply unpopular. Courtiers who'd grown accustomed to generous portions and flexible rules suddenly found themselves restricted. Servants who'd been supplementing their rations with extras from the kitchens got cut off. People who'd been bringing their own hangers-on to meals were told those individuals were no longer welcome. There was grumbling, there was resentment. Some historians argue that the unpopularity of the Eltham Ordinances contributed to Wolsey's eventual fall from power. When you make powerful people eat less, they remember it, and they hold grudges. But even with the restrictions, the sheer scale of consumption was still staggering. 20% less than an absurd amount is still an absurd amount. The court was still processing thousands of animals per year, still going through hundreds of thousands of gallons of ale, still serving multiple-course meals to hundreds of people twice daily. What the Eltham Ordinances really did was establish the principle that the Crown could regulate private consumption, that the state had an interest in what and how much people ate. That food wasn't just a personal matter, but a political one, a social one, an economic one, that your dinner table was, in some sense, public property. This principle would have long-lasting effects. Throughout the Tudor period and beyond, English governments would periodically attempt to control consumption through regulation, sometimes for economic reasons, supporting the fishing industry by mandating fish days, sometimes for social reasons, preventing lower classes from imitating their betters, sometimes for moral reasons, encouraging moderation and discouraging gluttony. Mostly, these attempts would fail. Because while you can write laws about food, enforcing them is nearly impossible when consumption happens behind closed doors. You can mandate fish days, but you can't station a soldier in every home to ensure compliance. You can limit the number of dishes by rank, but you can't prevent people from serving enormous portions of allowed dishes. The gap between the law as written and the law as practiced was enormous, and everyone knew it. The laws existed as aspirational statements, declarations of what the social order should look like even if reality refused to cooperate. There's a wonderful court record from 1538 where a wealthy merchant was brought before a magistrate for serving too many dishes at his daughter's wedding. The merchant's defense was essentially, yes, I served 12 dishes per course instead of the 6 I was allowed. But look at who was there. Half the local gentry attended. 3 knights, a bishop. I couldn't possibly serve them peasant fare. My reputation would be ruined. And you know what the magistrate did? He fined the merchant a token amount, something like 10 shillings, which was nothing compared to what the feast probably cost, and sent him on his way with a warning to be more careful next time, because the magistrate understood that the social pressure to host lavishly was stronger than any legal restriction could ever be. That's the fundamental tension running through all of these regulations. Society demanded excess. Status required it. Competition ensured it. You couldn't maintain your position in the social hierarchy without displaying your wealth through generous hospitality. But at the same time, that very excess was destabilizing, unsustainable, economically and morally questionable. So you got laws that everyone agreed were necessary and important, and which everyone promptly ignored whenever it was convenient to do so. The laws provided cover. If someone called you out for excessive feasting, you could claim you were trying to moderate, but circumstances made it impossible. These rules I have to follow. I'm doing my best. But the reality was that most people in positions to throw lavish feasts continued to do so, laws or no laws. And here's what really gets me. The people writing these laws, the people enforcing these laws, were the same people most likely to violate them. Wolsey created the Eltham Ordinances while living in cardinals' apartments that were more luxurious than most noblemen's entire estates. The magistrates fining merchants for excessive feasts were themselves hosting elaborate dinners. The clerks tracking every loaf of bread at Hampton Court probably went home and ate whatever they could afford without tracking a thing. The hypocrisy is breathtaking, but it's also very human. We're all capable of believing rules are important and necessary while simultaneously believing we deserve an exception to those rules. Our circumstances are special. Our situation is unique. We're not being excessive, we're being appropriate to our station, maintaining necessary appearances, fulfilling social obligations. The Tudors were masters of this kind of rationalization. They created elaborate regulatory frameworks and then created equally elaborate justification systems for why those frameworks didn't apply to them specifically. It's the same impulse that led them to declare beaver tails were fish, the same mental flexibility that allowed them to fast according to church law, while eating expensive seafood that provided more calories than most people's regular meals. Rules exist to be followed by other people. That seems to be the eternal human motto, and the Tudors lived it fully. But as we near the end of our journey through Tudor feasting culture, I want to shift our focus one last time, because we've looked at what they ate, how they prepared it, who consumed it, and how they tried to control it. What we haven't really examined is the deeper question. What does all of this tell us about ourselves, about human nature, about the eternal relationship between appetite and power, between hunger and status, between the things we consume and the people we become? That's where we're going now, into the territory of meaning and legacy, into the quiet truths that survive 500 years and still shape how we think about food, power, and what it means to feast while others go hungry. There's a substance that fundamentally changed Tudor England, that reshaped their cuisine, their health, their very conception of what food could be. It wasn't discovered in the New World. It wasn't a revolutionary cooking technique. It was something that had existed for centuries but only became widely available in the 16th century, transforming from rare medicine to status symbol to social obsession. Sugar. And it rotted their teeth right out of their heads. Let me take you back to the early 1500s, before sugar became commonplace, when it was still so rare and expensive that it was kept locked in spice cupboards alongside saffron and cinnamon. A pound of refined white sugar cost more than a skilled craftsman's weekly wages. It was literally worth more than meat, more than wine, more than most of the foods we've been discussing. You didn't cook with sugar, you displayed it. You hoarded it. You used tiny amounts on special occasions to prove you could afford something most people would never taste in their entire lives. And here's what's fascinating. Nobody thought of it as food, really. Sugar was medicine. It was sold by apothecaries alongside herbs and potions. Medieval medical theory, based on the ancient Greek system of humours, classified sugar as hot and moist, making it useful for treating conditions that were cold and dry. Coughs, chest complaints, digestive issues. Doctors prescribed sugar the way modern doctors prescribe antibiotics. Queen Catherine of Aragon, Henry's first wife, reportedly consumed sugar daily as medicine. She believed it helped with her recurring health problems, particularly her digestive issues. She'd mix it with rose water or dissolve it in wine, taking it as a tonic. The irony, of course, is that sugar was probably making some of her problems worse, but nobody knew that yet. The germ theory of disease wouldn't emerge for another 300 years. But by the 1520s and 30s, something changed. Sugar production in Portuguese and Spanish colonies ramped up dramatically. The Atlantic slave trade, which is a horror we need to acknowledge even as we're focusing on food history, created a labour force that could produce sugar on an industrial scale. And as production increased, prices fell. Not to cheap levels, sugar was still expensive, but to accessible levels for the wealthy. And that's when sugar stopped being medicine and started being dessert. The Tudors went absolutely crazy for sugar. They incorporated it into everything: sweet pies, candied fruits, marzipan sculptures, sugar plate, which was a kind of edible modelling clay made from sugar paste that could be shaped into elaborate forms, and the banquet course, which we've mentioned several times but need to explore properly because it represents a fundamental shift in how the English understood meals. The word banquet in Tudor times didn't mean what we think it means today. To us, a banquet is a large formal meal. To the Tudors, banquet referred specifically to the final course of a feast, a course served separately from the main meal, often in a different room, consisting entirely of sweet items. Here's how it worked. You'd sit through a massive multi-course dinner in the Great Hall. Meat, more meat, some fish if it was a fast day, bread, ale, wine, the whole elaborate production we've described. This meal might last 2 or 3 hours, and then, just when you thought you were done, just when you were so full you could barely move, a servant would announce that the banquet was ready. Everyone would stand, those who could still stand, and process to a different location. Sometimes it was a special banqueting house in the garden, a small structure built specifically for this purpose. Sometimes it was a private chamber that had been prepared while the main meal was happening. Sometimes, in grand houses, it was an entire separate building designed exclusively for the banquet course. And why move to a different room? Partly because the Great Hall was cold and draughty, and after sitting there for hours, people wanted warmth and comfort, but also because privacy. The banquet course was more intimate, more social, less formal than the main meal. Fewer servants were present, seating arrangements relaxed. The strict hierarchy that governed the dinner somewhat dissolved during the banquet. This was politically important. In the relaxed atmosphere of the banquet room, away from the formal dining hall with its rigid protocols, courtiers could have quiet conversations. Alliances could be formed, secrets could be shared, business could be conducted without dozens of people overhearing. The banquet wasn't just about eating sweets, it was about creating space for the kind of informal interaction that the main meal ceremony prevented. And what did they serve at these banquets? Everything was sweet, everything involved sugar. Typical offerings included comfits, which were seeds or nuts coated in layers of sugar syrup like an early version of candy coating. Anise, comfits, caraway comfits, coriander comfits, fennel comfits. The coating process took hours. You'd repeatedly dip the seeds in hot sugar syrup and let them dry, building up layer after layer until you had a smooth, hard candy shell. There were sweetmeats, which weren't meat at all, but candied fruits, flower petals, or roots. Candied orange peel was popular, candied ginger, candied angelica root, candied rose petals. Anything that could be preserved in sugar syrup became fair game. Marzipan appeared at every banquet, sometimes in simple shapes, sometimes in elaborate sculptures. The paste, made from ground almonds, sugar, and egg whites, could be moulded into anything. Tudor banquet tables featured marzipan playing cards, marzipan fruit that looked almost real, marzipan animals, even marzipan figures of saints or mythological characters. And it was flavoured, not just with almonds, but with cinnamon, pepper, rosewater, whatever expensive spices you wanted to demonstrate you could afford. There were marchpane subtleties, which were massive marzipan centerpieces that functioned like the sugar sculptures we discussed earlier. Some were several feet tall. They might depict a scene from the Bible or classical mythology. They served as table decorations for the entire banquet and would be broken apart and distributed to guests at the end. Jellies made another appearance, but sweet jellies this time, flavoured with fruit juices and wine. And here's where it gets interesting. These weren't served on plates. They were served in glasses, tall, clear glasses that showed off the jelly's translucent colour and perfect clarity. Guests would eat them with spoons, marvelling at how the light passed through the jelly, how it wobbled but held its shape. Why glasses? Because glass was expensive. Owning enough glass vessels to serve jelly to all your banquet guests was yet another demonstration of wealth. Everything at a Tudor feast came back to that same fundamental driver, proving you had more than you needed. And then there was drinking chocolate. Well, not yet. That wouldn't arrive until the next century. But there was hippocras, a spiced wine sweetened with sugar and flavoured with cinnamon, ginger, and other aromatics. It was served warm in small cups, sipped slowly while nibbling on sweets. The whole experience was designed to be leisurely. You weren't supposed to gorge on banquet foods the way you might have on the main meal. You were supposed to sample delicately, converse elegantly, perhaps play games or listen to music while you enjoyed these precious sweet things. And it was the lady of the house who typically oversaw the banquet preparation. Making banqueting stuff, as they called it, was considered women's work, specifically high-status women's work. The lady of a great household would personally supervise the making of comfits and sweetmeats, or even make them herself with her ladies-in-waiting. It was a mark of good household management to produce excellent banquet fare. At the royal court there was actually a separate department, the confectionery, dedicated entirely to sugar work. It was considered prestigious enough to warrant its own staff, its own budget, its own supervision separate from the main kitchens. The confectioners who worked there were specialists, trained in techniques that regular cooks didn't necessarily know, and the quantities of sugar involved were staggering. A single elaborate banquet for 50 people might use a 20 or 30 pounds of sugar just in the sweetmeats and comfits. A major feast could use 100 pounds or more. When you remember that sugar cost what it did, you realise these banquets represented enormous expenditures. But people couldn't resist. Sugar was addictive, literally as we now know, though they didn't understand the biochemistry. The more you ate, the more you wanted. And because it was associated with wealth and status, consuming sugar became a form of conspicuous consumption even more effective than wearing jewelry. Jewelry you could hide or take off. Your teeth told everyone exactly how much sugar you could afford. And oh, those teeth. There are contemporary accounts describing the dental decay that afflicted the Tudor wealthy. Black teeth, broken teeth, missing teeth. The more sugar you ate, the worse your teeth got. And perversely, this became a status symbol. Having black, rotted teeth meant you ate enough sugar to damage them, which meant you were rich. Poor people who couldn't afford sugar kept their teeth. Wealthy people who could afford all the sugar they wanted lost theirs. And instead of recognizing this as a reason to eat less sugar, some people actually blackened their teeth artificially to make it look like they could afford enough sugar to rot their teeth naturally. Think about that. People were deliberately ruining their appearance to pretend they were wealthy enough to have ruined it through consumption. The status anxiety was so intense that visible decay became desirable. Queen Elizabeth I, who succeeded her father Henry decades later, was famous, or infamous, for her terrible teeth. Foreign ambassadors remarked on it in their letters home. One Spanish diplomat wrote that her teeth were very yellow and unequal, and that she had a habit of covering her mouth when she smiled because she was self-conscious about them. But she couldn't stop eating sugar. She loved it too much. Marchpane was reportedly her favourite food. There's a poignant detail in the historical record about Elizabeth in her later years. She suffered from terrible tooth pain, but refused to have teeth pulled because she was terrified of the procedure. When she finally had to have a tooth extracted in her 60s, one of her counsellors had a tooth pulled first in front of her to show her it wasn't that bad. He underwent unnecessary dental surgery just to reassure his queen that she could handle necessary dental surgery. That's the power of sugar. It was so desirable, so delicious, so tied up with status and pleasure that people would endure terrible pain rather than give it up. Elizabeth knew sugar was destroying her teeth. Everyone knew. But knowledge didn't change behaviour. And the lower classes watched this happening and aspired to it. Because if wealthy people had black teeth from eating sugar, then having black teeth was something to aspire to. The symbolism became detached from the reality. Black teeth equals wealthy, therefore I want black teeth, even though the actual experience... Tooth decay is agony. It's such a perfect example of how status symbols can override rational self-interest. We know something is harmful, but if it's associated with people we want to be like, we do it anyway. The Tudors with their sugar. Modern people with 1,000 different choices that we know aren't good for us, but they signal membership in a desired group. But beyond the health effects, beyond the status symbolism, sugar changed the fundamental structure of English meals. Before sugar became common, there was no real distinction between savoury and sweet. Dishes mixed flavours freely. Meat pies contained dried fruits. Stews were spiced with cinnamon. The modern idea of dessert as a distinct course didn't exist. The banquet course created that distinction. It established sweet foods as a separate category, something that came after the main meal rather than alongside it. And that conceptual shift has lasted 500 years. We still organise meals around the savoury then sweet progression that the Tudor banquet introduced. There's also something deeply human about the Tudor relationship with sugar. They knew it was expensive, they knew it was hard to get. They knew it represented labour and suffering, though they were largely insulated from seeing the slave plantations where it was produced. And they consumed it anyway, voraciously, unable to resist even when the consequences became literally visible in their mouths. We like to think we're more sophisticated now, more conscious consumers, more aware of costs and consequences, but are we? We consume products made through processes we'd rather not examine. We eat foods we know aren't great for us because they taste good and everyone else is eating them. We participate in systems we know are problematic because opting out feels impossible or undesirable. The Tudors weren't uniquely flawed, they were just human. And their sugar obsession shows us something about what humans do when we get access to something intensely pleasurable that used to be rare. We don't moderate, we don't carefully limit ourselves, we gorge, we overconsume, we turn something that was medicine into something that makes us sick. And yet, despite all the decay and pain and excess, sugar also brought genuine joy. Those banquet courses, those intimate gatherings away from the formality of the Great Hall, those moments of sweetness after hours of meat and ceremony, they mattered to people. They were highlights. They created memories. A great banquet was talked about for months, not because of the main meal, but because of the sugar sculptures and candied oranges and perfect jellies that followed it. So was the Tudor sugar revolution a disaster, a tragedy of excess, or a completely understandable human response to newfound abundance? Maybe it was all of those things simultaneously. Maybe it was both warning and recognition. This is what we do, this is who we are when scarcity gives way to plenty. And that brings us finally to the question we've been circling this entire journey. After all these hours exploring what the Tudors ate, how they prepared it, who consumed it, what it cost, what it meant, what's the takeaway? What do 500-year-old feasts tell us about ourselves today? What lessons, if any, survive the centuries? What quiet truths emerge when we look honestly at the gap between the abundance they displayed and the hunger that existed just outside their palace walls? That's where we're going now, into the final meditation on appetite, power, and the eternal human struggle between who we are and who we wish we could be. So here we are, at the end of our journey through smoke-filled kitchens and candle-lit banquet halls, through gilded peacocks and blackened teeth, through the spectacular excess and quiet desperation of Tudor feasting culture. And I want to ask you something that's been on my mind this entire time. What if none of it was really about food at all? Think about everything we've explored together over these past hours, the 55 kitchen rooms, the 14,000 animals slaughtered annually, the fire-breathing peacocks and sugar castles and live birds exploding from pies, the elaborate rituals and strict hierarchies and laws attempting to control who could eat what, the servants camping on kitchen floors while nobles dined under canopies of gold, the beaver tails classified as fish and the teeth rotted black by sugar, and the loneliness of a king eating alone while hundreds watched. None of that was necessary for nutrition. None of it was required for survival. You don't need a peacock dressed in its own feathers with a gilded beak breathing fire to satisfy hunger. You don't need 14 courses when 2 would do. You don't need to slaughter 23 animals per person per year when a fraction of that would keep you fed. So what was it all for? I think the Tudors were trying to solve a problem that we're still struggling with today. They were trying to prove through the most basic human activity, eating, that they mattered, that they existed, that they had worth and power and the right to take up space in the world. Food was the medium they chose because food is universal. Everyone eats, everyone understands hunger and satisfaction, but not everyone can eat swan crowned with gold. Not everyone can afford sugar sculptures. Not everyone gets to choose from 14 dishes while servants carry away the untouched portions to feed the poor. That differential, that gap between what you consume and what others can only dream of, became the measure of status. And status, in the Tudor worldview, wasn't just about ego, it was about survival. If you fell too far down the social hierarchy, you lost your position at court, you lost your access to the royal household's protection, and patronage. You lost the benefits and opportunities that made life bearable, so you had to constantly perform your status, demonstrate it, reinforce it through every available means, and the most visible, most visceral, most impossible to ignore means was food. But here's what breaks my heart about the whole system. It didn't actually work, not in any sustainable way. Henry VIII spent enormous sums on food, transformed a quarter of Hampton Court Palace into a kitchens, employed 200 people just to cook, and still died sick, lonely, and probably in constant pain from that ulcerated leg. His excess didn't protect him from human frailty. It didn't buy him happiness or health or the male heir that would secure his dynasty. Elizabeth I ate all the sugar she wanted, had teeth so decayed that foreign ambassadors remarked on them, and still died childless with her succession uncertain. The sugar didn't sweeten her life in any meaningful way beyond the moment of consumption. The nobles who bankrupted themselves throwing lavish feasts to impress their rivals often ended up genuinely bankrupt, their estates seized, their families disgraced. The competition to outfeast each other was literally unsustainable. Several great families fell from prominence during the Tudor period specifically because they couldn't afford to maintain the level of hospitality expected of their rank. And the servants, the ones who made all of this possible, most of them died young, worn out from brutal labour, their names forgotten, their contribution to this grand spectacle completely erased from the historical record, except as anonymous entries in account books. So the system failed almost everyone involved, and yet it persisted. Why? Because the alternative, admitting that all this display was meaningless, that the peacocks and sugar castles and elaborate rituals were just expensive distractions from the fundamental equality of human mortality, that alternative was unthinkable. The entire social order depended on maintaining the fiction that some people were fundamentally different from, fundamentally better than other people. And food was one of the most effective ways to maintain that fiction. When a duke eats swan and a servant eats mutton, when a king dines alone under a canopy while courtiers stand and watch, when sugar blackens noble teeth but leaves peasant mouths intact, the message is clear. We are not the same, we do not occupy the same world, your hunger and my appetite are different categories of experience. Except they weren't, they aren't. Underneath all the pageantry, underneath the gold leaf and sugar paste and roasted peacock feathers, everyone was just trying to not be hungry. Everyone wanted to feel satisfied, to feel secure, to feel like they had enough. The nobles wanted it through excess, the servants wanted it through adequacy, but the fundamental desire was identical, and I think that's the quiet truth behind Tudor royal feasts. All of that spectacular abundance was driven by the same fear that drives the poorest person hoarding scraps, the fear of not having enough, the fear of going hungry, the fear that scarcity will return and you'll be defenseless against it. The difference is that nobles had the resources to act on that fear in elaborate ways. They could slaughter 14,000 animals and still worry it wasn't enough. They could serve 14 courses and still feel the need to add a 15th. They could build 55 kitchen rooms and still expand the complex. There was no amount of abundance that quieted the fear, because the fear wasn't really about food. It was about worthiness, about deserving to exist, about mattering in a world that could be terrifyingly indifferent to individual human lives. Now, does any of this sound familiar? Because we're still doing versions of the same thing. We don't have gilded peacocks, but we have other ways of performing status through consumption. We don't classify beaver tails as fish, but we have equally creative justifications for behaviours we know are excessive. We don't have sumptuary laws limiting dishes by rank, but we have informal codes about what kind of consumption is appropriate for different income levels. The mechanisms have changed, the technology is different. But the underlying psychology, that's remarkably consistent across 500 years. We're still using consumption to prove worth. We're still competing through display. We're still uncomfortable with the gap between abundance and scarcity, but not uncomfortable enough to actually close it. We're still capable of knowing something is harmful and doing it anyway because everyone else is doing it, or because it signals membership in a desired group. The Tudors aren't some alien civilization whose choices we can't understand. They're us, just in different clothes, with different tools, facing similar fears and desires and contradictions. And that means their failures can teach us something, not because we're so much better or wiser than they were, but because we can see the consequences of their choices in a way they couldn't. We know how it turned out. We know that the system collapsed, that the excesses became unsustainable, that the attempt to build hierarchy through consumption ultimately failed to create the security and meaning people were seeking. So what do we do with that knowledge? I don't think the answer is to condemn the Tudors or to pretend we're fundamentally different from them. That's too easy. The harder, more honest response is to recognize ourselves in their choices, to see our own status anxieties in their peacock feathers, to acknowledge our own overconsumption in their 14,000 slaughtered animals, to admit that we too use food and other forms of consumption to signal belonging, to prove worth, to build walls between us and the people we consider beneath us, and then maybe, to ask ourselves if it's working any better for us than it did for them. Because here's the thing about Tudor feast that stays with me. Despite all the excess, despite the incredible abundance and variety and spectacle, nobody seems to have been particularly happy. Henry died sick and bloated and paranoid. Elizabeth died alone after a reign of constant anxiety about succession and threats and the performance of queenship. The nobles competed endlessly without ever achieving security. The servants laboured without reward beyond basic survival. All that food, all that effort, all that display, and it didn't buy happiness. It didn't create genuine community. It didn't solve the fundamental human problems of meaning and connection and mortality. It was just stuff. Expensive, elaborate, sometimes beautiful stuff, but ultimately just stuff that got consumed and forgotten. What did endure? The relationships, the moments of genuine connection that happened despite the system rather than because of it. The banquet course conversations where hierarchy relaxed and people actually talked to each other. The kitchen workers who formed their own communities in the margins of the palace. The few recorded moments when someone chose generosity over display, connection over performance. Those moments were rare. The system actively discouraged them, but they happened, and they mattered more, I suspect, than any of the peacocks or sugar sculptures or elaborate pies that have been lost to time. There's a recipe that survives from the Tudor period that I love because of its simplicity. It's for something called pottage, that basic vegetable and grain soup that we've mentioned several times. The recipe says to take whatever vegetables you have, whatever grain you can afford, maybe a bit of meat if you're fortunate, and simmer it all together until tender. Season with whatever herbs grow near your house. Serve it hot with bread. It's the opposite of elaborate Tudor feast culture. No gold leaf, no exotic spices, no performance or display, just honest food made from available ingredients shared among whoever's hungry. And you know what? That recipe still works today. You can make Tudor pottage in your kitchen right now with ingredients from any grocery store, and it will taste good and nourish you. But you can't make a fire-breathing peacock. You can't recreate the sugar London. You can't slaughter 14,000 animals to prove your worth. The elaborate excess is gone, possible only in that specific historical moment with its specific economic and social conditions. What survives is the simple stuff, the honest stuff, The food that was about feeding people rather than impressing them. And I think there's a lesson in that, in what endures and what disappears, in what actually nourishes versus what just dazzles temporarily, in the difference between feeding hunger and performing abundance. The Tudors chose performance. They chose spectacle. They chose to turn eating into theatre and food into power. And we can see from the safe distance of 5 centuries that while it was often spectacular and occasionally beautiful and always fascinating, it ultimately didn't give them what they were really seeking. So maybe we can make different choices. Maybe we can recognize the impulse to prove worth through consumption and choose connection instead. Maybe we can see the fear driving the excess and address the fear rather than feeding it. Maybe we can build tables where everyone actually gets to eat rather than some people feasting while others go hungry. Or maybe we won't. Maybe we'll keep doing variations on the same themes because these patterns are so deeply embedded in human nature that changing them is nearly impossible. I honestly don't know, but at least we've looked clearly at what the Tudors did and why, and what it cost. At least we've spent these hours together, examining the spectacular surface and the troubling depths beneath it. At least we've asked the hard questions about appetite and power and what we're really hungry for when we sit down to eat. And maybe that's enough for tonight. To have looked carefully at a slice of history and seen ourselves reflected in it. To have recognized both the beauty and the brutality of human attempts to create meaning through consumption. To have sat with the uncomfortable truths about hierarchy and waste and the distance between abundance and hunger. Thank you for staying with me through this long exploration. Thank you for letting me share these stories about peacocks and kitchens, about servants and kings, about sugar and teeth, and the eternal human search for enough. I hope you found something valuable in the journey. I hope the next time you sit down to a meal, maybe you'll think for just a moment about what it means to eat, who made your food possible, and what you're really feeding when you feed your body. There are so many more stories waiting to be told. So many other historical moments where food and power intersected in fascinating ways. So many other cultures and times and tables worth exploring. I'll be back soon with another journey, another dive into the strange and beautiful ways humans have nourished ourselves and used that nourishment to build worlds. Until then, sleep well, dream of simpler feasts, and remember that you, right now, wherever you are, whatever you have access to, you already have enough. You always did. Good night, my friends. Rest easy.